The entire crowd that came took up burning torches and shouted that the witch needed to be burned right away. After all, it was because of her that absolutely all the barns burned down, and now it would be very difficult for the whole village to survive. At this time, the man led the red-haired girl in front of everyone to the place of her future and inevitable death. But at one point, a little girl screamed. She asked to stop and not to burn the girl. Circinia was a noble and pleasant 20-year-old girl who had never done a single bad thing. This tale told the story of a simpleton who by chance became the bride of the heir to the throne. And one day, one girl woke up in the body of Circinia, who was the villain and the main character. Initially, the girl was a sorceress of the Belfar Empire who had the ability to control fire. Using her sinister abilities, Circinia could easily gather and emit heat, making her invincible. In addition to all the atrocities she committed, the girl disfigured her mother and also managed to burn down half of the empire. In addition, she attempted to kidnap and kill one of the heirs of a major family. However, the prince managed to thwart all the vile plans and survive himself, which led to the death sentence of Circinia. Because she was unable to resist her vicious nature, she came to a most terrible death. This death was one of the attempts to show the power of the great heir, who eventually found his happiness. When the girl first found herself in Circinia's body, she was very afraid that her fate would be the most terrible. But for better or worse, it happened 3 years before the story began, which meant there was an opportunity to change fate. If the girl had gone into hiding and stopped her atrocities, she would most likely have managed to save her head. Also, if they decided to burn the girl at the stake, she would survive because he was not at all scary to her. When everyone starts to breed him, Circinia should just add fuel to the fire to avoid the fuss in the end. People, seeing the clouds of ash, would assume that the red-haired girl would simply burn to ashes. In the end, everything went exactly as she expected. The audience was going to light a fire for Circinia. But suddenly, an unknown guy rode up on his wonderful horse, thereby distracting all attention to himself. The witch didn't understand who this guy was, and then became sad because of the suddenness of the whole situation. The tall guy stood in front of her, after which he kindly announced that he would now free the girl. At that moment, he freed Circinia's hands and carefully brought one to his face, after which he kissed it. Looking into the guy's eyes, the witch realized that he seemed completely familiar to her, which is why she could not push him away from herself. Circinia swore to herself that she had smelled this scent once before, which is why it was familiar to her. And at one point, it dawned on her that this guy was most likely her Ben, even though he was completely different from the one before. At that moment, the guy said that he missed his Circinia very much, which is why he was looking for her. Previously, the red-haired girl was a fan and queen of gambling, where she very often hit the jackpot. Everyone who saw her wins considered the girl magnificent, and very often wanted to ask her how she managed to win so often. They were also interested in whether Circinia felt rich with so many chips, but the witch understood perfectly well the fact that she should give up gambling, because it was becoming an addiction for her. The girl was already starting to go crazy, which is probably why she won so many times in a row. At that moment, the ball fell into the cell with the number 16 again, which meant another win. The witch rose from the table and joyfully shouted that she had managed to win again. She was well aware of the fact that she was finally able to get rid of the life of an evil witch and start living like an ordinary person. It turned out that the girl entered Circinia's body in the evening when she fell asleep after reading the book. And when she woke up, the girl was already in the body of a wonderful witch with fiery red hair. She also possessed not only a charming appearance, but also terrifying fire powers. Circinia was one of the most cold-blooded people, and was also not afraid of fire due to her abilities. But also, no one has seen the other side of the fiery girl, where there was only loneliness. The girl was a villain that everyone wanted dead, and in the end, they got it. When the girl found herself in the body, she thought that now the end of her life would come, which almost made her go crazy. But more than 4 years had passed since the story itself, but everything was fine with Circinia. Until one moment, absolutely no one knew that the red-haired girl was a potential witch. She believed that such sudden changes happened precisely due to God's will. As a result, the girl decided that she should start living on her own and earn money carefree. If Circinia had become rich, she would have been able to avoid the original ending of her life, and therefore live much longer. When the girl was told that the gambling club had no money at the moment, she was somewhat surprised. The servant politely replied to Circinia that the club was currently in a difficult situation. He also added that the Count was supposed to return soon, after which the girl could talk to him. At this point, the witch announced that it would be better if no one refused to pay her winnings. The guy told the girl again that they couldn't do it at the moment, after which Circinia broke one of the chips. After which she suddenly started breaking the table. The girl lost her temper and screamed for her money to be returned. The witch understood the fact that it would not take long to transfer the money, although it was said that it could take a week. Previously, the girl would not have been able to do anything like this because of people's reactions. But now nothing stopped her. Suddenly, the guy told the girl that he could make a small guarantee especially for her. After walking with him for some time, Circinia asked him again what the guarantee was that was being discussed. Suddenly, she saw a cowering boy in front of her, sitting in a dark room deep in the corner. It turned out that this guy had been taken into slavery quite recently, and at a very decent price due to his age. Hearing these words, Circinia suggested that the Count could have deliberately taken the child as a slave. The minister told the girl to believe him that this guy was worth a lot to himself. At this moment, the girl became furious because earlier he had said that the Count had absolutely no money at the moment. Circinia was aware of the level of her anger, which is why she tried to calm herself down so as not to repeat her past mistakes. It was necessary to calm down only in order not to burn down this casino prematurely. The worker asked the girl to remain calm because the Count would definitely pay everything after some time. At this time, the boy continued to sit in the corner, but began to squeak a little, saying that he needed help. Circinia calmed herself down and realized that now she had to think much more radically than usual in order to save money. As she looked at the boy, she realized the fact that his case was completely covered in bruises and abrasions. Also, his body was completely emaciated. Most likely he had not eaten for a very, very long time. The boy cringed when he realized that the witch had finally approached him. He was very scared. Suddenly, Circinia carefully extended her hand to him and asked the boy to look at her. He held out his hand to her distrustfully, after which he felt a wonderful warmth and calm throughout his body. At that moment, the girl said that she agreed to take the boy as collateral and then asked to convey this. Circinia immediately reported that if the Count had not paid her winnings within a week, she would have simply burned down the entire building. When the girl returned to her home with the slave, she said that she wanted to renovate the house with the money she had won. But the plans changed dramatically. Instead of money, she brought one child, received as collateral. When Circinia was about to treat the boy's wounds, he began to deny it, saying that everything was fine. The girl told him to come to her without making her count to 3 to do it. After these words, the guy immediately ran up to the witch, after which she began to bandage his wounds. At this time, the boy asked Circinia what her name was and what he could call her all the time he would be with her. When the girl asked a question in return, the boy looked away and said that he had no name at all. The witch, feeling awkward, quickly changed the subject, thereby asking him how old he was now. The boy timidly replied that he was 19 years old, thereby greatly surprising the girl. She understood perfectly well that the guy looked like a schoolboy, but in fact he was only a year younger than her. When asked if he was hungry, the boy said that everything was fine and there was no need to feed him. At this time, Circinia approached the pot of soup and said that if the boy did not eat everything today, the soup would be spoiled. While she was making a fire, she realized that this was the first time she had used her magic in front of someone. One could only hope that this guy wouldn't tell anyone what he saw. At that moment, he looked with admiration at the bright red-haired girl and energetically asked her if she was a witch. Circinia calmly told him that she was the only one who could control fire, and then told him not to blab. Suddenly, the boy asked the witch if she ever felt lonely living away from all people, after which she said sadly that after so much time she had become accustomed to all this loneliness. When the boy addressed Circinia formally as mistress, the girl asked him to address her simply by her first name. She understood perfectly well the fact that now was not the time to get attached to anyone, especially when the guy would be gone in a week. Suddenly, the witch said that she thought about the child's name. She suggested the boy to become Ben. At first, Circinia thought the boy didn't like his name, but then he denied it, saying he liked it. He was glad to receive at least some name, and especially from such a wonderful girl, because of which he could not help but like it. Earlier, the Empire began to allow the construction of gambling houses, after which the Count lost his palace in the casino. Then he needed a lot of money to gain the Emperor's recognition and to get a lot of money. Eventually, a year later, he managed to buy the palace, but now he paid off his debts through gambling. The chances of winning the jackpot were very small, and it was also designed to benefit the Count himself. But Circinia managed to hit the jackpot more than once, which greatly destroyed the owner's dreams. If he had given her the money, he would have ended up bankrupt, which is why he decided to use Louis as protection. After some time, he returned to his palace, after which he began to yell at his assistant for all the chaos. Suddenly, the minister began to make excuses, saying that all this was the work of one red-haired girl. The Count raised his voice even louder, because he could not believe that a man could not cope with a woman. Louis started screaming that this woman was crazy and had very strange powers. She used strange abilities that made her feel very hot, and a gust of wind lifted her hair. At that moment, the man realized that his worker, although stupid, could not have come up with such nonsense. The Count asked what had happened to his purchased slave, after which he became furious that the boy had been given as security. He started yelling at the attendant for letting such a valuable item go to some girl just to give a guarantee. The man's wealth was limited, especially in comparison to Entiu, who was the richest in the empire. The Count really liked to see handsome boys and men in front of him, which is why he took this slave. After this, the master sent a worker to look for the one he had given as collateral, and he ordered the slave to be returned. It turned out that the man wanted to meet that very person a week later, but the payment was lost. Also, the man could not pay Circinia with money at the moment, which is why the guy had to be taken away without additional conditions. While Ben was eating, the girl really wanted to get to know the guy better, so she started talking to him. Suddenly, she noticed that he was still hungry, so she offered him some more food. She also began to pressure Ben by saying that if he didn't eat the soup, it would go bad and be thrown out. But deep down, Circinia understood perfectly well that the guy was accustomed to slavery. At the same time, the witch continued to say that if Ben didn't finish eating, she would throw away the leftovers. Without thinking twice, the guy sat back down at the table and said that he would try to finish everything that was left. A few minutes later, she heard Ben break another plate, bringing the total to nearly 5. After which, Circinia silently took a broom and was going to clean up all the shards. She also was not angry at the boy for his misdeed. At this point, Ben asked the girl to give him the broom. He was ready to clean everything himself. Most likely, earlier, when Ben was a nameless creature, he was taught that if he did not work, then he would not eat. Suddenly, the girl noticed that the guy jerked sharply, which is why she turned to him with a question about what happened. Ben started apologizing to the witch for cutting his hand. He was afraid of what she would do. Circinia sat the boy down and took the broom, after which she told him not to apologize for such trifles. A couple of minutes later, the girl took the first aid kit and cotton wool, after which she began to treat the injured finger. Looking at Circinia, Ben understood the fact that because of her beauty, he could not do anything calmly, which is why he made so many mistakes. He also realized that it was very warm next to her, so it seemed to him that the witch was his light. Circinia carefully dabbed the boy's finger with cotton wool, almost finishing the treatment. After the girl finished treating the injury, she asked the guy to be more careful next time. At that moment, Circinia noticed that in a couple of days the boy had caught up with the girl in height. When she realized the fact that Ben had grown so much in just 3 days, she was in a state of great confusion. But she was also happy that she could see the boy growing, which is why she planned to feed him more in the future. That night, Circinia saw that Ben was having another nightmare, which was not the first time. Without thinking twice, the witch decided to warm him with magic, while telling him that everything would be fine. There was nothing more she could do. All she could do was warm him up and calm his breathing, and then hope for him to sleep. She also thought that the guy's past, which he dreams about every night, was to blame for everything. Understanding this fact, she knew that she could not return the former slave in such a state back into such hands. She also knew that she needed money to survive, but despite this, Circinia was going to take care of the boy. Suddenly, at that very moment, Ben opened his eyes, thereby frightening the witch because she thought that he woke up because of her. The guy looked at Circinia with embarrassment, after which he smiled tenderly at her and thanked her. At that moment, the girl realized that everything she did to Ben, he saw from the very beginning. It turned out that the guy pretended to be asleep so as not to scare her, but now he was incredibly grateful. Without thinking twice, the witch smiled and told him not to worry about it, after which she wished him good night. In the morning, the witch was already waiting for Ben with her scissors to tidy up his head, but the guy always refused to get his hair cut, which made it seem like he either really didn't want it or was afraid. Ben shook his legs and did not let the scissors cut him. which left Circinia unable to do anything for a long time. After some time, he was finally able to calm down, thanks to which the girl began cutting her hair. When she finished her scissor work, she noticed that Ben had a fever and was burning all over. At that moment, he jumped up from his chair and was about to run away from the girl for some distance to calm down. Circinia grabbed him sharply and told the boy to stop acting like that, thereby scaring him. At this point, Ben admitted that he was about to jump out of his chest, after which the witch suggested that the guy might have had a heart attack, which would require him to go to the hospital. At that moment, Ben said that he felt much better, after which he returned to the chair and asked to cut his hair again. When the job was done, Ben said he wanted the warmth of the witch's hands to always remain on his hair. At this time, the servants wanted to find one person, but they could not do anything, although they tried their best. Since there was a notion that this person was needed urgently, the whole group was confident that they would find him. The curse lasted only 2 years, which is why the boy had to be urgently returned to the palace. It was also not at all necessary to bring him back alive. It was just necessary to find his body. At the same time, Ben was having fun with Circinia, and they decided to bake bread together. The girl soon realized that she was completely out of food, which was why everything simply came to an end. Seeing the witch's commotion, Ben excitedly asked her what had just happened. Suddenly she changed the subject to the fact that she had not eaten meat for a long time, which is why she should go to the market to buy some. The guy, like a little dog, asked the girl if he could go with her. When Circinia refused Ben, his face immediately became sad, which made the girl feel awkward. She also understood the fact that she still had no money, which is why she had to sell her jewelry. Circinia loved to dress up for any occasion, so she never spared money on clothes and jewelry. She spent a fortune that her parents had on jewelry. The girl clearly understood that the witch was very lucky with such a life. Besides, now she had something to live on. At this point, Ben told Circinia that it would be very dangerous to walk alone, although walking with him was much more dangerous. The girl asked the guy to be a nice and obedient guy who would try not to break anything. Then she was about to leave, having previously announced that she would not stay long at the market. At one point, Ben told the girl that he would be waiting for her, which made the witch smile. A little later, she came to the jewelry place where she gave her jewelry and asked the price for it. Since childhood, Circinia has loved jewelry, which has given her a very good taste in fashion. At this point, the man told the girl that there was a scratch on the ring, which prevented him from offering a high price. The witch realized that there was not a single scratch on the ring at home, so she looked at it with disdain. The jeweler gave her the ring so that she could see for herself what had happened to it and evaluate the scratch. Since she knew perfectly well that there could not have been a scratch, she guessed that it was a deliberate scratch, after which she grabbed the man. At that very moment, he pulled his hand back, after which he began to explain some of the purposes of the piece of iron, which first of all stripped the ring of its wrapper. Hearing these words, Circinia grabbed the expensive ring and then ran this very piece of iron over it. Seeing what the girl had done, the jeweler was horrified because the ring was made of pure gold. Then he shouted that he would not give the girl her ring for more than 103,000. Not intending to mince words, the witch said that she would not leave the man until he gave her 500,000. At that moment, the girl patted the jeweler on the shoulder and told him not to look at her appearance, because she was not so simple. After this, Circinia began to insist that she would expect no less than 500,000 from the man. At this time, the jeweler reluctantly raised the price of the ring. When it reached 400,000, the witch's eyes began to shine. When she received her money, she happily went home, saying that he just needed to give the money right away. After some time of shopping, the witch bought everything she needed. Next time, she was going to take Ben with her, although she understood that the guy would have to leave her in a couple of days. But they could also spend some time with each other, despite the fact that fate would soon separate them. At that moment, Circinia heard the words of strangers who were looking for her. There could also be a guy a little shorter walking with her. Initially, they wanted to find only him. As she turned the corner, the girl began to think about why that guy would look for her. At that moment, she realized that they were looking for her for Ben, which could become very dangerous for the guy. Suddenly, Circinia remembered that the guy was home all alone, so she should hurry so that they wouldn't get to him first. She turned around abruptly and ran towards the guy with all her might in panic and worry. At this time, Ben was in a state of excitement. When the girl touched him, his heart began to beat much stronger. He was very confused by his thoughts, but was glad that, despite his origin, he received warmth and care from her. The red-haired girl seemed very cold and unapproachable, but in reality she turned out to be affectionate and caring. The witch was also the very first person to call the boy by his name. He had never been called that before. Ben was very pleased to know that it was Circinia who gave him such a name. At that moment, he began to feel very embarrassed because the girl saved him, and the guy's conscience allowed itself such thoughts. Realizing the absurdity of the situation, Ben realized that he should go and get some fresh air. When he started living with a girl, she assigned him the laundry, which meant he now had to do his laundry. He began to think about how good it would be for him if, after all this time, he learned to cook. At that moment, he heard Circinia's steps, which made him joyfully turn around and begin to greet the returning witch. She suddenly pounced on the guy, after which she began to ask excitedly if Ben was okay. Ben didn't understand what Circinia was talking about, so he asked her in surprise what could have happened to him. Once the girl was sure that everything was okay, she told the guy that she was just worried that he had broken the plates again. Ben became very embarrassed by such closeness. He began to understand that thanks to this, the witch could easily feel his heartbeat. Suddenly he said that he was ready to help the girl take her purchases to their place. As he walked away, he thought about how his desire to be close to Circinia might disappear in the future. At this time, the worker apologized to his master for not being able to find that slave. The Duke expected this, and ordered the servant to prepare 30 million shillings to pay the girl. Since she was supposed to come to them in 3 days, they should have prepared the money in advance. The surprised guy looked awkwardly at the gentleman and asked him if he was really ready to pay such a sum. In any case, they wouldn't be able to leave everything as it was, because they would still have to pay money to get the deposit back. But first, it was necessary to find out where the witch herself lived along with the pledge given to her, after which the Duke planned to kill the girl and take away by force all the shillings that she had won. At this time, Circinia was forcing Ben to eat again, and now he cooked everything himself. The guy started talking about how he was simply happy to watch his Circinia enjoy the food he had prepared. At this moment, the girl was very surprised by Ben's behavior. He behaved like a teenager in love. The guy still couldn't get his head around what he had started doing without even noticing his behavior. Suddenly, when the girl dropped her fork, the guy started to panic and immediately ran for another one. Circinia was very embarrassed, and at that moment she did not understand what made her do this. She also couldn't believe it because she knew very well that she liked muscular guys. As Ben brought another fork, Circinia thought that although his face was attractive, Ben was too thin. Suddenly she stood up abruptly and, out of embarrassment, said that she was already about to leave the table. The guy started apologizing to her, to which the girl told him not to react so strongly to it. As she quickly left, Circinia reported that the boy could have finished off all the remaining meat. When night came, she could not sleep because of the strong flow of different thoughts that had greatly forgotten her head. The girl realized how stupid her action was, which was the main reason why she couldn't sleep. She also understood the fact that communication with Ben was simply like a long-term attachment. At home, her boyfriend was like a little brother, which made her feel very sorry for him. Circinia understood that very soon she would upset the guy by simply exchanging him for the money she had won. She also needed to get rid of the villainous image that was inside her in order to live a happy life. When the realization came that the day of separation was very close, the heart began to beat harder and harder. The witch understood that if she showed fortitude, she would make this separation easier for Ben himself. But also, if the guy returned to the casino, then most likely he would be made a slave again. At this point, Circinia asked Ben where his birth mother was, after which she learned of her death. She asked the guy about it again, and he added that at the age of 13 he was enslaved. It turned out that despite all the time that had passed, he still could not forget his mother's cry. He was also very lonely, so no one ever called him by name, only Circinia gave him a name. The girl couldn't stay with Ben, even if she really wanted to, because in the end it would be very bad. The plot could have turned against the girl at any moment, and the guy would have been killed as well, despite his innocence. At this point, Circinia decided it was time for her to start distancing herself from Ben, so she dryly told him that she would do everything herself. At first, the guy didn't understand why she answered that way, but he didn't argue and simply agreed. The remaining time they could be together was running out very quickly. The day of parting with Ben came. That day, Circinia realized one fact. Most likely it dawned on the guy that she could not leave him. Despite all the mental pain, he smiled as if everything was absolutely fine, which surprised the girl. As the sun began to set, Ben took the witch by the hand and together they went to the true owner of the slave. At this time, the man sat and was very nervous. He was afraid that Circinia could change her mind. In front of him lay a letter from the richest count, who was eagerly awaiting a meeting with the casino owner. The man understood that he was expecting only one slave, but nothing more. He just wanted to please the other count. At that moment, he stood up and began to shout at his worker because the woman had not yet returned the slave. Suddenly, Circinia entered the palace with Ben. At first, no one recognized her because of the hood. When the man saw her face, he was pleasantly surprised by her beauty, which he did not initially expect. Without thinking twice, he asked Circinia to return the deposit she had taken a week ago. As Ben walked forward, the count realized that the boy had gained weight and had also changed his hairstyle. Circinia began to understand that for these people, Ben was just a pawn and a toy, which is why she believed that it would be better for the guy to stay with her. Suddenly, the man said that the girl should not worry about the safety of the slave. They were ready to provide him with the best conditions. After all, the rich man promised to take care of this child, so he would be happy living there. It turned out that Ben was supposed to leave for other possessions the following morning at dawn. The worker gave the girl a suitcase containing her winnings, amounting to 30 million shillings. After the money was handed over, the slave was quickly taken and led away from the witch. Her face immediately changed with emotion, and at that moment they began to tell her to take her check. Suddenly, the girl confused the owner, who, according to him, only wanted to make a successful deal. She wasn't going to let him get away with following the girl. If it happened again, Circinia would punish the man. Suddenly, he asked Louis to bring a notebook in which the girl was supposed to leave her signature. After this, Circinia realized that from now on, Ben's hands would always be cold, because now there was no one to warm him. After some time, the count began to torture the slave by force so that he would tell about the girl's powers. But when Ben refused to talk about it for the umpteenth time, the man lost his temper completely and said that he would find out for himself. After the beating of the slave was over, the count ordered that the boy not be touched. He did not deserve such treatment. Suddenly, he gathered his last strength and shouted that no one should dare to lay a finger on his Circinia. But because his hands were tied, he would not be able to do anything to the count in any way, which the count understood. Suddenly, he said that most likely all this behavior of the slave had its own certain charm. The man did not want to spoil the slave's beautiful face, but he had to do it because he was too impudent. After which, the exhausted Ben was again placed in a dark room, where he would have to sit out the remaining time. At this time, Circinia lay down to rest, but she could not fall asleep because of all the thoughts that drove her crazy. She decided to start moving somehow, in which case the bad thoughts could go away on their own. As she walked around the house, she began to imagine various moments with Ben's presence, and she realized that she had begun to have auditory hallucinations. The most vivid moments in which only Ben and she participated finally began to appear in my head. At that moment, Circinia finally decided that she should bring Ben back to her, even if the final price was terrible. She felt she had an obligation to return him and rescue him from slavery. Circinia was going to return absolutely all the money back to the count, and in return, get her Ben. And at that very moment, the girl saw in front of her all those people who were present during the return of the deposit. Circinia was very unhappy with such an impudent visit from these guests. It really bothered her. At this moment, the count, who was accompanying everyone, asked her whether the girl was going to return for the slave. If she wanted to know where the slave was, she would have treated the guests accordingly. Otherwise, she would not have found Ben. The count could not believe that the girl was so worried about this unfortunate and pitiful slave. When the man began to cross all boundaries of what was permitted, the evil image of Circinia awoke in the girl's body. Upon seeing this picture, the man immediately realized that his employee was talking about exactly these forces. Suddenly, all those who had weapons with them began to attack the enraged witch at once, all wishing her death. At that very moment, the witch grabbed one of these very people by the throat, causing the guy to begin to choke. The count began to shout at her that she could not kill him because only he knew the location of the slave. The sinister spirit of the witch shouted at her to rip out the man's tongue and then press it to his throat. Trying to keep her composure, Circinia knew she couldn't kill him, which meant she had to keep her sanity. The count began to feel that the witch had finally calmed down, which made him happy and immediately relaxed. When the man said that during the beatings Ben only thought about the girl, which greatly surprised Circinia. Hearing all these words, the witch could no longer control her mind, and finally she gave in. Fire began to appear around the witch, and she began to burn everything that stood in her way. The confidant standing behind the door, seeing the flames of fire, was immediately horrified by what was happening. He fell to his knees in severe shock. For him, it was all something incredible. The Count screamed for someone to save him. He did not want to die such a painful death. He begged Circinia to stop all this. At this moment, the man was ready to admit his mistake. Making his way through the fire, the Count crawled to the girl and almost tearfully began to ask her to simply help him. Circinia was a true witch who did not spare anyone. She did not feel pity for any person. The transformed girl tried to calm down and begin to control all her powers, which was difficult. If the girl had not done this, she would have ended up following in the terrible footsteps of the witch and would have died a tragic death. Seeing that all those who were present earlier with the Count were armed, were unconscious, and most likely dead. When she decided to check the bodies, she realized that the Count was still alive. All that was left was to pull him out. After some time, she carried all the people out of the burning house and threw them on the ground. She told the guy that there were multiple burns on the bodies, but despite this, everyone was alive. The worker's master took the full brunt of the rage on his own body, from which he suffered the most. If the guy were sane, he would never start blaming the girl for what happened. She also said that no one should even dare to follow her, when suddenly he asked the girl to stop. She reluctantly turned around and then, looking menacingly, asked him what he wanted from her this time. Suddenly the guy said that the witch should go to the pier of the Surrey River. That's where the slave was. Looking at him sternly, the girl asked what he had planned against the witch by reporting all this. At that moment, the guy handed her some papers from his suitcase, saying that she would find it all useful. The worker had no plans against the girl. The money belonged to her. His only concern was to keep an eye on the Count. He bowed before the girl and then told her that God would be on her side. After that, the girl immediately ran to the indicated place. She really wanted to be next to Ben. She was well aware of the fact that after going through everything, she could not remain without a boyfriend. At this time, Ben was being led to his place. Due to the batch of slaves received, the night was supposed to be difficult. The boy realized that from now on, everyone treated him the same. Only Circinia accepted him as a human being. She was the only one who helped him understand what real care meant. Ben missed his beautiful Circinia terribly. One of the men who was leading the slave began to order the guy not to waste so much time, but to stand up immediately. But realizing that the slave was resisting the order, he decided to temporarily retreat from it and just take a smoke break. At this time, Ben realized that he could no longer feel the warmth he had received from his beloved witch. Lying on the cold, wet ground, Ben looked up at the sky and watched the raindrops fall. Now he wished that everything in this world would be washed away by the rain, except for Circinia's hut. At that moment, he heard the girl's voice, which caused his face to immediately change, and he began to look around and search for her. He saw a red-haired girl running towards him in front of him, shouting his name and looking for him. The witch immediately ran up to the wet guy and began to tell him that she would definitely free him. Seeing the whole situation, Ben's eyes almost started to tear up because in the end, the girl came to save him. Using her powers, she carefully burned the tight rope tied to the boy's body, thereby freeing him. After this, Ben, who did not believe what was happening, began to reach closer to the girl, thereby testing her existence. Having recovered a little from what had happened, the guy asked the girl if everything was okay with her, because the Count wanted to find her. At this time, Circinia examined the guy's body. It was all covered with new abrasions. When the girl asked about his health, Ben replied that he was completely fine. The witch immediately apologized to him for leaving him alone, although she shouldn't have done it. Happy Ben carefully told the girl that she shouldn't have apologized for that, because he was glad she was back. The witch reported that she had to be alone all the time, as she could not fully control her powers in a surge of emotions. Now Circinia was afraid that she would end up causing irreparable harm to Ben because of her abilities. But after parting with her boyfriend, the girl realized that she was constantly thinking about him. She remembered his voice, his facial features. She couldn't forget anything. It was because of these thoughts that she gathered her strength and decided to bring Ben back to her. The witch madly wanted to be near the guy, no matter what might happen. Having said these words, Circinia understood that Ben would most likely reject her now, because she simply abandoned him. Overwhelmed by bad thoughts, the girl couldn't even look in Ben's direction, but he asked her to do so. At that very moment, the guy affectionately said that he, too, had been constantly thinking about Circinia since their separation. He came as close as possible to the girl, after which he tenderly said that he wanted to be only near her. After some time, the witch burned the document confirming Ben's slavery, thereby freeing him. The guys wanted to find a place to stay for the night where no one knew them, and then start their lives from scratch. So they went where their eyes looked, wandering at first through various surrounding areas. During the trip, the boy and the girl talked about a variety of things, discussed the cities and places they passed through. On the third day of their journey, they found a quiet village where they decided to stop. It turned out to be the village of Moulin. Originally founded by only 3 people, it soon began to grow. After some time, the elder helped the boys find a small house in the vicinity. Spending time together in a quiet house where no one disturbed them, the girl and the guy were happy. As Circinia walked down a busy street with Ben, she realized she had to buy him some new clothes. They were also told that the village was well known for its woodworking. Here, the masters worked very hard on various projects, and from the difficult tasks, they acquired beautiful bodies. It was impossible to tear Circinia's eyes away from the pumped-up bodies. The girl really loved this. When Ben called out to her, the witch began to justify herself by saying that her attention was drawn to the woodworking process. But the guy was perfectly aware of the fact that this was not the case at all. She was watching the bodies. Circinia didn't want to tell Ben about her preferences right away, so she decided to hide it. The guy showed the girl a beautiful bracelet, and was then surprised when she wanted to buy it. He decided to tell her to look at the rest of the jewelry because she could find something better. At this time, those who were looking for Ben reached the place where the girl's old hut stood. Suddenly, one man noticed that the former hut, which was quite large, had somehow burned down. The assistant wanted to ask about this, but he couldn't say anything more about it. The man realized that this time they were late and that he should report it to the master. Suddenly, he noticed a lot of jewelry on the ground, after which he decided to look at them and estimate the price. At that moment, he informed his assistant that they could not delay. Now they had to find Ben without fail. He said that if anyone were to stand in their way, he would greatly regret his decision. In the morning, Circinia enjoyed her tea under the warm rays of the sun under the window. She looked at the fence and enjoyed the wonderful and calm day. She wanted to live like this every day. Now she had absolutely no desire to wind herself up over various reasons her life began to improve. At that moment, Ben ran up to her and happily announced that he had been able to find a job. When Circinia heard this, she began to feel that she was not bringing in enough money for both of them. But then the guy said that he got a job as a carpenter. He was happy with his job. Suddenly, the girl laughed pleasantly and tenderly, after which, covering her mouth, she congratulated the guy on his new position. After a couple of seconds, Ben approached the girl and calmly asked her to hide her charming smile. Many different thoughts ran through his head, and he found it difficult to restrain his desire to kiss the witch. Some time later, Ben told the girl that he would be doing the laundry today, which allowed Circinia to rest. At that moment, the girl at first did not understand his desire to help, because he had the hard work of a carpenter ahead of him. But at that very moment, she remembered that she could have left her underwear in the dirty clothes. She immediately rushed to the guy to immediately take her things, after which she began to ask him to stop. At this point, Ben was already holding the witch's bra in his hands, and she started yelling at him to leave the washing to her. When the guy realized what was in his hands, he immediately felt very embarrassed by what had happened. He immediately began to apologize to the girl for taking him with him, which made the girl laugh a little. Circinia asked the guy to calm down because he began to panic very badly. After some time, the witch decided to treat Ben's wounds, after which she noticed that they had become significantly less numerous. One of the reasons the girl agreed to treat the guy's wounds was the opportunity to see his naked torso. At this time, the girl's head was spinning with the thought that Ben had reacted too emotionally to her underwear. Although her reaction was no better, because she screamed at him across the entire yard that he had her underwear in his hands. Suddenly, the girl noticed a scar on Ben's shoulder and decided to ask him where it came from. It turned out that the guy himself didn't know where it was from, most likely. It was left over from his childhood. Without thinking twice, the guy asked the girl if they could sleep together that night. On the day they met, Circinia had allowed it to happen, and since then it had happened every night, and now it seemed to her that it was time to start resting separately. But at night she realized that she couldn't refuse his puppy dog look again, and they went to bed together again. Suddenly, Ben asked the girl to take her hand. Although he felt a little awkward, he decided to do it. He told the girl that because her hands were always warm, the guy fell asleep more easily. After much thought from Circinia, Ben assumed that she was against it, which made him a little upset. But the witch again could not refuse him, so she extended her hand to him, thereby making the guy happy. Circinia didn't know if it was because of her powers, but when she came into contact with Ben, she felt great. Also, besides this, she could feel his heartbeat, which confused the witch a little. At night, the girl woke up from the fact that she was overcome with emotions. But when she realized that the guy had fallen asleep, she calmed down a little. After she fell asleep, Ben opened his eyes. Without thinking twice, he kissed the girl's hand, enjoying the moment. The guy began to feel very embarrassed by what he had done, and he mentally apologized to Circinia for what he had done. At this time, the searchers found out where Ben was. They informed the master about his location. It took about 2 days to get to the village of Moulin, located in the south, by horseback, and after receiving the order, the team set out there. The group commander was well aware of the fact that he absolutely had to get what he wanted. It was Ben who had to stand before his greatest count. In the morning, the guy greeted Circinia and invited her to the table because he had specially prepared breakfast. Ben's culinary skills were getting better every day, which made the witch gladly agree to have breakfast. She absolutely loved the potato pies that Ben made. And the realization that the guy is trying especially for her makes eating much more enjoyable. Suddenly, the girl, looking at Ben, realized that the guy had somehow changed over the past few days. The witch told the boy that he was a little burnt, which left Ben puzzled. When she saw that the guy was happy that this happened to him, the girl was surprised. But in any case, Circinia was glad to see the smile on the guy's face because it was beautiful. During breakfast, the guy and the girl had a good time, and at the same time discussed many things. After some time, Ben was about to leave for work, and the witch decided to see him off. When he left, she thought about how she walked the guy to work every morning as if they were a married couple. A little later, Circinia realized that she could rest peacefully because Ben had done all the chores around the house that morning. Today, the guy was supposed to receive his first salary, which he had been eagerly awaiting all month. Without thinking twice, the witch decided to cook something for the guy, since he had been cooking everything himself for a long time. At the same time, while Ben was doing the work given to him, one of his employees asked him what he was going to do. He replied to the man that he wanted to make a certain gift with the money he received. The employee assumed that the gift was intended for Ben's girlfriend, thereby greatly embarrassing the guy. But he understood perfectly well the fact that Circinia was only his savior and protector. In gratitude for her deeds, he wished to become her protector in return. He hoped that she would approve of his decision. At this point, the second man joined the first man, and he said that if the guy and girl were not together at the moment, they would definitely be together in the future. Ben couldn't even think about it. The guy didn't understand his feelings and couldn't decide on his desires. At the sight of the girl, he felt hot. He madly wanted to kiss her on her wonderful lips and also hug her around the waist. And from these thoughts, desires only became stronger at the sight of Circinia's breasts. He experienced a surge of feelings. The workers said that if they were not a couple, they were in the best marriage. At this point, Ben was burning with shame, so he immediately rushed to continue his work. In the evening, after work, the guy received his salary and wanted to get to the store before it closed. The guy also hoped that the girl would like his gift, even though it was not particularly expensive. While he was thinking, men appeared behind the guy, which Ben didn't pay much attention to at first. When he finally realized that all these men were confidently following him, Ben was horrified. At this time, Circinia was already preparing her wonderful soup. Only a little bit remained until it was ready. The sun was about to set and the boy was supposed to return home, but this time he was late. The witch had been waiting for her friend for a long time, but even after sunset, he still did not return. The witch began to be tormented by various thoughts about why Ben never returned home. In the morning, she went to his work to ask if they had seen her boyfriend. After long wanderings, the witch was unable to find out from anyone where Ben had gone. They either did not know him at all, or simply did not know where he had gone. For a long time, Circinia was in despair after Ben left. She could not recover from what happened. After a long time, a girl named May began to worry about the condition of her savior. This time, Circinia woke up at the main entrance of the house after her sleepwalking, which made her a little out of it. May asked the girl if the witch was hungry after all this, and then asked about her health. Circinia lay down on the bed again and began to remember what she had dreamed about. It had been the same thing for a long time. It came back to her again and again that she was still waiting for Ben after everything that had happened. And after that, she had a headache for a long time. May came into the girl's room and asked the witch if she had a headache again. She sat down on Circinia's bed, but Circinia asked the girl to just leave her alone for the moment. But May replied that she would not leave the witch, no matter how much she tried to persuade her. After all, there was no one else to take care of Circinia in her difficult situation, only the girl could do it. Looking at the girl, the witch began to understand that during the entire time the girl lived with her, she had grown a lot. She met her when she begged for mercy because she had never stolen anything, but she was accused of it. The girl was moved back and forth for a long time. She was treated in the most terrible way and was often bullied. But at one point, Circinia stood up for this girl and began to worry about her. And after a few days, the witch extended her hand to her and asked the girl if she could do something herself. Exactly 2 years ago, the witch offered her help to the girl, and from that moment on, they lived together. The girl began to open the curtains in the room, while telling Circinia that furniture was supposed to be delivered to the village today. She was very surprised when the girl broke the table in two with just one hand. Suddenly, after what she said, the witch abruptly kicked May out of her room, thereby surprising the girl. In the village of Moulin, where Circinia settled with Ben, she lived for about a year, and most likely Ben would have returned there. But the guy still wouldn't have had any precise information about her now, which would make the search more difficult. The witch was angry with the guy for several months, because he left without saying a word to her. But the girl couldn't tell anyone anything, which is why her behavior made many people worry. Also, because of what happened, she had to leave a lot of things in her past, no matter how painful it was. Since the boy and girl had only lived together for a couple of days, the witch shouldn't have been so upset. After this, Circinia decided to leave the village of Moulin without regret, freeing herself from the past. There had been no news from the guy for about 3 years, which made the witch very upset about the guy. Now the witch asked May if she had eaten this morning. The girl replied that she wanted to have breakfast with Circinia. But she noticed that the girl was not going to have breakfast this morning. Instead, she was going to go somewhere. Trying to put her worries aside, May wished the girl a good walk and asked her to be more careful. Since Circinia became her only savior, May was very worried about the girl. The girl understood perfectly well that her savior looked rather distant, but in fact, she was very caring. Also, if the girl wanted to kick May out of the house, she would have done it a long time ago. But the girl also could not understand what was happening to Circinia, because she seemed to be fading before her eyes. The girl sometimes looked out the window, but her eyes seemed to wander like ashes in the wind. It was because of this that May decided to stay with Circinia, no matter what the outcome. The girl decided to cook her savior her favorite potato pies before she arrived. At this time, when the witch got out of her surroundings, she began to feel more alive. She wanted to get away from all her thoughts, which is why she decided to go to one of the noisy places. She also remembered that May's dress was already quite worn out. She could buy her a new one. But even if she had done this, the girl still liked her very first dress better. Suddenly the girl was grabbed by the Count, whom she had not seen for more than 3 years. He held her tightly by the wrist. He greeted the girl, saying that they had not seen each other for a very, very long time, and a desire for revenge could be seen in his gaze. Circinia looked at the man sternly with her cold gaze. She did not want to answer his questions because it was none of his business. One day, a murderer broke into the witch and May's house, and May met him at the entrance. When she saw a massive male silhouette in front of her, she began to scream in fear, and the killer ran away in surprise. As Circinia was about to leave the clingy Charles, the girl turned around and began to put her dark cape hood on her head, hiding her red locks of hair. Seeing that the witch was not listening to him at all, Charles began to be very indignant, but did not interfere with her. The girl understood perfectly well that he most likely had a reason to wander so openly around the area, without fear of anyone. He, being the son of a chieftain, had his own certain power, because of which he behaved as if the whole world was at his feet. At that time, the whole point was simply that the boy's father was simply very well acquainted with the Lord, thanks to which he had connections with the aristocracy. It was obvious to Circinia that he thought that there was only one woman living in the house, which is why he showed up in the middle of the night. At this point, Charles began asking the girl if she had any evidence that he was the one who had committed many of the crimes. The witch immediately realized that the man knew that she had no evidence, which is why he was taking advantage of the moment and irritating her. Suddenly, Circinia told him to watch his words, because if he was caught, the witch would not spare him. When the girl started to leave him, Charles started to stop her because he had not finished what he had planned. He couldn't allow himself to be neglected so much in this village, where most people only wanted to please and get attention. The man was furious with the witch's behavior. He believed that at the slightest difficulty, Circinia would simply break down. When he wanted to grab the witch to stop her, she abruptly transferred its action to himself. He found himself in the strongest grip of Circinia. All the people who saw what was happening were in the wildest horror. No one could believe that such a fragile girl was capable of such a thing. As soon as Charles started to choke, Circinia immediately let go of him, thereby letting the man know that he should not mess with her. She immediately told him that he had attacked her first, and Circinia had simply taken retaliatory measures. Many people saw Charles pestering the witch, but said nothing about it, because the man was the elder's son. The son started yelling at everyone because they were just watching a man being humiliated by such a girl. One boy immediately helped him. He lifted the count up on his feet and helped him walk, which made Charles feel even worse. Suddenly he turned around because behind his back, some guy began to quietly talk about how Circinia was a witch. Charles began to listen to him attentively, and it turned out that Circinia had already run away a long time ago and could not be here now. When the son attacked the victim, he began to say that this witch was a real monster and that it was she who left the burn on his face. In the evening, the girl brought a new and beautiful wooden table to her hut, which surprised May greatly. Circinia also handed the girl her new dress, which left May a little confused. When she unfolded it, her eyes sparkled with delight. It was a wonderful little pink dress. The girl looked at her savior and thanked her for all the care she had provided. The witch did not feel hostility towards the girl. She was also grateful to her, but at the moment the girl wanted to live the story peacefully. She shouldn't have become more attached to someone because there had already been a moment that had thrown the witch off track. Suddenly the girl simply turned around and started walking out of the room where Met was, surprising the girl. At night, a man wandered through the forest examining the area. He did not find anything interesting, and the journey was long. But because the man had a meeting scheduled for the following morning, he wanted to return as soon as possible. After walking a little further, he began to smell something burning, which immediately made him wary. Soon he saw a burning house, which scared him. At this time, Circinia woke up in front of the threshold of the house because she felt cold. When she realized where she was horrified. This time, she was again not in her bed after sleep. Whenever a girl opens her eyes, she is in different places. Previously, she at least woke up within the confines of her own home, but now she woke up on the street, which was very bad. Circinia knew the name of this disease very well. She suffered terribly from her sleepwalking every night. She always walked in her sleep, not realizing that it was very inconvenient in terms of life. Now the girl will have to lock the gate every time so that she won't be able to leave the house in her sleep. She walked forward a little and began to realize that her body was gradually freezing, which meant she needed to return home as soon as possible. At breakfast, May asked Circinia if everything was okay with her, since she had slept all day after her bath. Since the witch looked unwell for herself, the girl began to worry about her well-being, but it turned out that everything was fine. At that moment, May told the girl that the barn had burned down during the night, which had destroyed the entire harvest of that year. There was information that the fire started because someone set something on fire inside, and as a result, everything nearby burned down. Since it was in this barn that the entire harvest was stored for the winter, the culprit would not have been allowed to get away with it. At that moment, people started knocking on Circinia's hut, shouting at her to come out immediately. When the witch was about to leave, May asked her to stay, because apparently those who came were hostile. But Circinia asked the girl not to worry about anything, and most importantly, not to stick her head out, and at that time the girl needed to check something. When the girl left the house, everyone simultaneously began to accuse her of being the one who burned down the barn with her witch powers. Charles began to tell her that the witch would suffer a very serious punishment for what she had done, and she would not be able to avoid it under any circumstances. Circinia leaned against the door and calmly asked the people if they really thought she was the one who started the fire. Charles immediately replied that there was no one else to do it, which is why the girl became guilty. The man realized that simple conversations with the girl would be useless, so he said that he had a witness on his side. A frightened boy came up and didn't want to say anything, but the count ordered him to tell everything he had seen. When the boy began his story, Charles looked at him sternly and told him with his eyes to continue. He put pressure on the guy by saying that his lady love was with him at the moment, and now was a very good opportunity to prove himself. and at one point he screamed that it was really Circinia who set fire to the barn, thereby destroying the harvest. The witch looked at him with incomprehension and coldness and asked him again whether he had really seen her. Charles told the girl not to even try to threaten Golden, because everyone already knew the whole truth. He added that she had already done this with one of the huts before, so there was no doubt at all. Goosebumps ran across the girl's body. She couldn't believe that the man remembered what happened 3 years ago. According to the guy, one hut was not enough for the witch, which is why she decided to burn down the entire village at once. At that moment, May ran out at the people, waving a broom and screaming that Circinia had been with her the whole time. The girl stood up to protect her savior and did not allow people to do what they had planned. They immediately began to think that the girl was an accomplice, which is why an order was given to catch both of them. When May was grabbed, she began to scream and struggle, causing her to hold on tighter. Seeing what was happening, Circinia's evil essence began to awaken in her body, which is why she was told that this would not have saved the girl. If the witch had given herself up, Charles was prepared to do so without touching the little one. At that moment, the girl started screaming at the girl to just run away without thinking about her. But Circinia had no intention of doing this, so she stayed with Charles, who was delighted with her conquest. After some time, the girl was put behind bars, and Charles decided to visit her to enjoy her pitiful appearance one last time. He was also willing to give the girl a chance to leave her life, but for that, she would have to kneel before Charles. In that case, he could have told his father to spare the witch and simply forgive her. But Circinia had no intention of humiliating herself in front of Charles. She tried to remain calm and not pay attention to him. Understanding this, the man began to put pressure on the girl by saying that with such behavior, she had clearly signed her own death warrant. Suddenly, the witch answered him that Charles was not even able to touch the girl's body with even a finger. This made the man very angry, and he started kicking the prison cage and yelling at Circinia. At this time, the girl was thinking that she really should die, because it was unknown how long she would live such a terrible life. No matter how luxuriously she lived, no matter how delicious her food was, the witch felt nothing because of loneliness. Circinia had been feeling very lonely for 4 years now, which had left her terribly exhausted. The Count was incredibly outraged by the witch's enormous pride, which made him even more angry. But for Circinia, all this was already meaningless. She was ready to close her eyes so that all this torment would end. After some time, everyone gathered in the main square and shouted that this witch had to be destroyed. Stones were thrown at the girl as she was led to the place of her death, and absolutely everyone present wanted her to die. Mentally, Circinia did not understand what they called dark magic, and before accusing her, she had to at least work on her accuracy. The girl was blamed for all the troubles that happened, thereby declaring a real witch hunt. All Circinia had wanted lately was to live in complete peace, where no one would bother her, but this turned out to be very difficult. During the death sentence, May began screaming at everyone to let her savior go, because she had done nothing wrong. The girl's behavior reminded the girl very much of Ben's behavior several years ago, which made Circinia wonder how he was doing. Nothing helped her forget about the guy. The memories of Ben remained in her heart forever. They would not disappear anywhere. The guy was worried about the girl even in moments when he himself had to suffer greatly. At this point, the witch began to come up with a plan for her salvation. She could simply burn the entire village and escape. Since her powers had been exposed, it was expected, but Circinia wondered if they would pursue her after that. But in this case, she would have to get burned a little. The witch was going to run away with her roommate May. Charles began shouting for everyone present to watch as the witch was about to surrender, after which the man whispered in the girl's ear that the witch's death had crept up on her completely unnoticed. From Charles's reasoning, it was clear that he assumed that the witch was currently in a state of extreme fear. But to save her life, she simply had to ask Charles himself for his help. After they started setting everything on fire, Circinia knew that everything was going perfectly according to her terrifying plan. Once the fire was lit, one had to maintain one's common sense, otherwise everything would have gone to waste. Suddenly, the witch heard the army's cries for the soldiers to surround and catch Charles himself, which made the girl very surprised. A few minutes later, the man was already grabbed and began to be led away, although he tried to break free from the strong grip. At that moment, one of the soldiers approached the girl and said that he would immediately remove the ropes from her body, thereby freeing her. When she was untied, the witch could not understand why events had turned out this way, because even the local guards should have been against the girl. At that moment, Circinia saw a wonderful guy in uniform in front of her who addressed her kindly. Looking at him, the girl could not understand who he was, because she had never met him before. When the man took the girl's hand and kissed it, the witch was puzzled as to why he did this. But at that moment, Circinia saw little Ben's look in the man's face, which made her unable to believe it. After her assumption, the girl carefully compared him with the boy, after which she came to the conclusion that they were not similar. But suddenly the man told the girl that during his recent absence he had missed her madly. He also noticed that the girl had lost quite a lot of weight, after which he asked her how she felt. The grown-up Ben felt incredibly sorry because he ended up almost being too late and his Circinia would have died. At this time, the girl realized that the boy's voice had become very velvety, like that of a real man, and in general he had changed very much. Ben handed his Circinia some warm clothes while she tried to make sure it was really him. But when he noticed the marks of ropes on her hands, the man became furious because no one dared to touch his Circinia. After he threw his jacket over the witch, he threateningly announced that he would kill the person who hurt Circinia. When he pulled out his sword, the witch was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he was really ready to kill Charles. After all, in the girl's opinion, a person who was just recently a defenseless child became capable of doing such a thing. Charles lay tied up in the corner, screaming in horror to be untied immediately. But the embittered Ben was not going to spare the man because he had put his Circinia in great danger. If he had arrived a minute later, the inevitable would have happened, which deserves a greater punishment than just murder. As Ben's sharpened sword touched Charles's throat, the witch screamed at the man to stop. But he didn't want to stop, because this count had treated Circinia terribly. But the witch couldn't allow Charles to be killed, so she repeated to Ben that she had asked him to stop. After thinking for a while, Circinia asked Ben why he had returned here after so much time. After all, just recently he was still a harmless teenager who was shorter than her. Now he has grown into a real man with his own new life. His hands were already completely strong. There was not a single scar left on his face. After slavery, he began to live very decently for himself. He had a wonderful life the whole time he was away, and only Circinia ate scraps. As the girl had previously assumed about his current terrible life, she was very much mistaken. Right now, after all the pain she had gone through, the witch felt like a complete fool. Ben, however, could not understand why Circinia was now trying so hard to turn him away. Suddenly, the girl informed him that if he had already finished his work, he could go back to his domain, after which she turned around and walked back to her hut, running through many thoughts in her head. If Ben had not appeared in her life in the first place, she most likely would not be suffering so much now. There was nothing more painful than simply losing the person closest and warmest to your heart. Because of this, she felt terribly bad. She felt empty inside herself for these 3 years. Ben disappeared from her life completely on a whim without saying a single word about it, and now he's back. At that moment, May followed Circinia and began asking her how the girl felt. When the girls arrived at their home, Ben knocked on their door, causing the girl to ask the witch if she should have opened it. At this point, Circinia told May to pack all the things that were important to her, because now it was no longer possible to stay in the village. Suddenly, May became sad and said in a sad voice that if everything continued like this, it would be very bad. But for Circinia at the moment, none of this mattered at all. At this time, Ben sat on the threshold and wondered whether he had really returned too late to his Circinia. The witch heard Ben calling her very clearly, which made her feel uneasy. May informed the girl that most likely this man was waiting for the witch outside. Circinia couldn't understand her feelings, because at that moment she loved and hated him at the same time. The girl was interested in some questions, but she didn't know if she should ask them right now. But suddenly she decided to ask her savior whether she was upset by the man's arrival, after which she added to her question why the witch could be so cold towards him. But she wasn't going to ask the main questions that interested her at that moment, because most likely everything was as she assumed. May wanted to know if this was the man Circinia had been looking for in her dreams all along. Deep down, she knew perfectly well what the consequences of each of her questions could be. Suddenly, Circinia told May that it was he who disappeared 3 years ago without saying a word, and now he just returned. Most likely this made the witch very angry, because he had the opportunity to at least warn her. When May suggested this, Circinia was shocked, as she had never thought about it before. But in reality, after Ben left, she wasn't just angry, she was terribly upset by this act. The guy treated her as if the girl deserved it. But on the other hand, she shouldn't have worried about him so much. At that moment, May told the girl in support that if she were in that situation, she would have done exactly the same. Suddenly, Circinia asked the girl to help her a little, because she herself did not want to go out. A little later, the girl came out to Ben and told him that no matter how much he asked, Circinia would not come out. At this point, Ben asked the girl how long she had lived with his Circinia and how well they knew each other. When the girl reported to the man that everything was fine with the witch, he calmed down a little. May thanked Ben for what he did for the girl today, because it was a very strong act. And after that, the girl asked him to leave this place, because this was the wish of Circinia herself. May was ready to convey some of the guy's words to her, but after he left her territory. Since it was indeed Circinia's request, she could do nothing about it, no matter how much she wished he were there. May was always on Circinia's side, no matter how much she wanted to help Ben. After some time, the man's assistant approached him with some information. All these lands belonged to the Earl of Dexter, whose son was eventually arrested. The disgruntled man ordered his assistant to simply destroy the man for his misdeed. But the soldier understood perfectly well that it was very risky, because Ben received his title less than a month ago. At the moment, his position was too unstable, which could lead to serious consequences. From a political point of view, this could mean that the man wanted to take control of everything. At that moment, the assistant remembered Circinia and how easily she was able to influence Ben. She was the mistress for more than 3 years. It was because of her that all this happened. And at that moment, the captain announced that this action would be very disliked by Circinia herself. After these words, Ben thought about the fact that she really didn't like such cruelty to people. Ben reported that in that case it was necessary to leave that count alive but not to allow him to be freed. At this point, the confidant asked the chief how much he was going to tell the girl about what had happened. Ben was ready to tell her everything if Circinia was ready to forgive him after that. If she would only open her door and look at him, he would immediately begin to explain to her what had really happened. He was ready to accept any reaction, to accept her resentment, but at the same time to tell her everything and stay close. He would never give up because he wanted to be the one the girl could rely on. Ben was ready to wait until Circinia forgave him. He had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. As the witch tried to fall asleep, the falling rain began to remind her of the very day she freed Ben. After that, she decided to distract herself by wondering if May had packed the things that needed washing. Suddenly, she decided to go outside and see if Ben had left the area. When she looked out, she saw him in front of her. He bowed before the girl, saying nothing at that moment, thereby confusing Circinia. After the girl approached him, he told her that he had been completely wrong all this time. He took the witch by the hand and kindly asked her not to leave him so coldly again. At home, she told him to stop calling her, because at that time, she was standing in front of him. The witch lit a fire in the fireplace, after which she thought that she should look for dry things for Ben. She was about to go into the pantry and ask the guy to just sit still and warm up. When he meekly replied that he would do so, the witch realized that Ben had not changed in any way except for his physique. Circinia returned a couple of minutes later, and Ben was already happily greeting her, like a faithful dog. She handed the guy a shirt and showed him where the restroom was where he could change. When he saw his shirt, the guy said that he assumed that Circinia had already thrown out all his things. Hearing these words, the witch became embarrassed, but replied that she had simply not cleaned up her pantry for a long time. In her mind, the girl understood that she simply couldn't throw away the shirt immediately after the guy left. But she did not tell Ben these details because she considered it her weakness. When the guy asked about her wrist, she couldn't believe that even now the guy was worried about her. At that moment, she saw that the guy's lips were badly bitten, after which she told him to stop doing that. Ben noticed that Circinia's hands were still as warm as they had been years ago. Suddenly, the guy said that all the time he spent without Circinia, he thought about her all the time. After these words, the girl sent Ben to the bathroom so that he could take a bath there and then return to her. At this time, she thought that after his return, she would treat him to tea and then ask him again about his new life. But at one point she noticed Ben's jacket. She assumed that it would most likely have to be washed. As she began to examine it, her gaze fell on the pattern of the buttons, which the girl had not seen before. It was a lion's face with snakes around it. After fully realizing the picture, Circinia began to guess where the guy was from. At that moment, Ben came out of the bathroom, looked at the girl, and told her that she was very pale. After this, he excitedly asked her what happened, after which he suggested that Circinia was cold. Suddenly, the girl asked Ben who he was. First he disappears, and now he shows up as God knows who. Her face became more and more severe. She repeated her question to the guy about who he was. After Ben asked her again what she was talking about, the girl drew his attention to the pattern of the buttons. She had never seen him before in life, but she had read a lot about him in books. It was one of the symbols of the crown prince's entourage, or rather the emblem of the first family that persecuted Circinia. She couldn't believe that she was able to see this in real life, but she also couldn't understand why Ben had it. In the original story, the Duke was called the Crimson Lion of the Empire, which was true to his nature. It was hard to believe that someone who was an ordinary servant, given as collateral, was the heir. But after Ben appeared in front of the girl last night, this fact was most likely true. When Circinia asked the boy what his real name was, he replied that he had remained Ben his entire life. But he was also Alexander Shorbach, which horrified Circinia because everything began to come together. At that moment, the guy said what he was now ready to answer all the girl's accumulated questions. It turned out that Ben learned about his origin exactly 3 years ago, when he disappeared. That day, disguised people came and took Ben away, pretending to kidnap a person. While he was given the opportunity to live in the Duke's family, Ben received the lesson of an heir for 3 years. After the death of his father, Cantred, the boy inherited the highest title of Archduke. In the novel, the Duke did indeed die, but he died at the hands of his son who wanted to seize power. But at this point, Ben made his own mistake, because he was unable to find Circinia before this time. Suddenly, Ben asked Circinia if she had received any letters from him, since he sent her a large number of them. When he learned that the girl had not received anything, he quickly looked away and apologized for the question. He understood perfectly well that all this happened precisely because of his fault, because he thought that he would explain everything personally. Circinia understood Ben, but she decided to ask him about what he came back to her for. Ben immediately began to reject the idea that he had been asked to capture the witch, because that was absolutely not the case. The indignant witch asked him again why he was looking for her in that case, and added that he should not hide anything. Suddenly he replied that he had returned because of the former vow to be together that they had given to each other 3 years ago. He remembered every moment of his life with Circinia and never forgot anything, especially the oath. He always wanted to be close to Circinia. He didn't need anyone else. When Ben invited the girl to move to the capital with him, the witch couldn't believe it. After that, the guy asked the girl that people in this place were always trying to harm her, and she did not consider this place dangerous. But at that moment, Circinia wondered if she could be sure that all this would be safe. In addition, she did not want to get involved with the main characters of the novel in the capital, which is why she lived in remote villages. If Ben had been the guy he was 3 years ago, then she would have believed the words without fear. But now it was difficult. But the guy would have been happy with any option. He just wanted to live near Circinia, which is why he was ready to move in with her. He again apologized to the witch for everything that had happened and asked her to allow him to stay with her. Ben was well aware of how shameless he had acted, which made him feel ashamed when suddenly Circinia looked away. She couldn't send him back to her place in such rain, which is why she was ready to make a bed for him. Suddenly, May came out of her room and told Circinia that she had woken up very early today. At that moment, the girl immediately began to tell the girl that if she was hungry, the witch could quickly cook something for her. After which she began to abruptly lead May out of the room, saying that today the girl herself wanted to cook something. At this time, Ben was thinking about why his letters did not reach the girl's house. The guy began to assume that some person could have been deliberately preventing him from communicating with Circinia. That night, when everyone went to bed, Ben saw a wandering witch in front of him, which surprised him quite a bit. He approached the girl, put his arm around her shoulder, and then asked why the witch was walking around in the middle of the night instead of sleeping. But at that moment he noticed that Circinia was still sleeping, which led him to assume that she was unable to find the room, from which Ben decided to carry the girl into the room, so he carefully took her in his arms. Various thoughts and desires began to come into his head, but Ben realized that he had to come to his senses. To get to Circinia's room, one would have to cross the living room anyway, because that was the only way to get through. At that moment, he heard May's displeased voice behind him, asking him what the guy was doing. Suddenly, she realized that this time Circinia had again left her room and was walking around the house. May explained to Ben that the witch was actually sleeping, but was acting as if she was awake. The girl told the guy about what is called sleepwalking, which surprised Ben because he did not know this. Ben's hand clenched into a fist as he asked May to tell him more about the process. It turned out that May had been observing this since she met Circinia 2 years ago. But at that time, such things happened quite rarely, but recently they have only begun to become more frequent. Most likely, this had happened before meeting her, but it was because of this problem that the witch could not sleep normally. After hearing this story, Ben began to worry about his Circinia, but at that moment the girl said that it was normal. However, deep down, May told the boy that if he wanted to help Circinia, he should have come earlier. At this point, Ben told the girl that he would take Circinia back to her room, to which May gave her consent. When the girl was in her bed, Ben looked at her and clearly understood that the witch was beautiful. Her beauty made her seem unreal, which gave the feeling that the girl would disappear as soon as the guy looked away from her. The thought was spinning in Ben's head that he had no idea that the girl had such a serious illness. He put his hand on the girl's face and gently asked her not to get sick, because it was very uncomfortable and bad. He also still wanted to kiss her lips and just touch the girl's body because he liked her. But the girl herself was much more important to him than Ben's greed, which is why he could not allow himself to do this. At the moment, he was ready to wait until Circinia herself wanted the same. When the morning came, the wonderful girl woke up in her bed, which she did not understand at first. The moment she realized this, she realized that she had not been sleepwalking that night, which allowed her to get some sleep. Suddenly, she saw Ben lying on the edge of the bed in front of her, asleep, which made her quite surprised. She wondered why the guy was sleeping here since he had previously been in his room. When the girl wanted to wake him up to ask this, Ben reflexively grabbed her and threw her to the floor. At that moment, a frightened Circinia asked Ben what he had done, since she had not even attacked him. The guy started making excuses about how it was just a habit, which made the witch think. Ben immediately blushed deeply, covered his face with his hand, and then embarrassedly pointed to the witch's hand. Circinia looked at where her hand had been and immediately realized that it had been touching his thigh. She immediately pulled her hand back and began to apologize for what happened, thereby embarrassing Ben even more. Already embarrassed, Circinia told the guy that it would be better for her to go out first, after which she immediately ran away. As she walked into the kitchen, she thought about what had happened, realizing what a shame it had been. At that moment, she met Arzan, who called the girl to him and told her his position. Circinia walked up to the man, after which she also introduced herself to him and extended her hand for a handshake. Ben's assistant gently took the girl's hand and told her that it was an honor for him to meet her. Circinia noticed that he greeted her as if the girl were the heroine of a movie. When Arzan kissed her hand, a disgruntled Ben appeared behind Circinia and asked the guy what he was doing. The assistant replied to his master that it was simply a greeting and nothing more. After Arzan left, Ben told Circinia that she should wash her hands before eating. At this point, the assistant returned and apologized to Ben, because he had not thought that the gentleman would be so angry at the greeting. Suddenly, Circinia asked the guy his name again, after which she invited him to have breakfast with everyone else. When everyone sat down at the table, May felt awkward and asked Circinia if she had put in too much salt. Arzan and May noticed that the boy and girl had not looked at each other all morning, which made them wary. The girl also looked at Arzan, realizing that he was very wary about something. It was at this point that she realized that she should finish her breakfast, which is why she said that she was full. Suddenly, Ben sternly asked his assistant to go out with him. They needed to talk about something. After the two guys left, Ben sat the assistant down on his lap in front of him and told him that at this rate he wanted to die. Realizing his mistake, Arzan apologized and then informed the gentleman that the Crown Prince wanted to meet with him. Apparently, this happened because news reached him about what happened last time. Ben looked away and thought about it, because he had just met someone he hadn't seen for 3 years. But it was even better this way, because the Crown Prince should not have been given the opportunity to take an interest in Circinia. Arzan also didn't know where the letters written by Ben for Circinia had gone, because the scheme for sending them was complicated. First, they had to be handed over to the family butler, and he, in turn, had to send them to their destination himself. When the assistant's master was Cantrid, the boy had no choice but to do as he was told. Ben immediately realized that Burdick, who was close to the former duke, had been bothering him all this time. Suddenly, the guy said that Burdick should be stripped of his powers in the Shorebark family today, and that he should be locked up in the basement. After some time, May watched how deftly Ben managed the dishes with his hands without breaking them. At that moment, she decided to tell the guy about potato bread, after which she asked him if he knew how to cook it. When May told the boy that Circinia loved him madly, the girl indignantly shouted the girl's name. But since it was true and the witch ate practically nothing except this bread, she did not object to anything. After this, the girl said that she had done nothing wrong. She had simply told about the witch's preferences. After a while, May showed Ben where all the ingredients they would need were. When Ben made his potato bread, Circinia noticed that it was baked better than usual, and at that moment she realized that different and rather incomprehensible feelings began to creep into her head, which the witch did not initially understand. While the girl was sitting in thought, May asked her what Circinia was so worried about, since nothing seemed to have happened. After her question about whether the witch would help today, the girl replied that May would ask herself. After some time, Ben approached the girl and told her that at the moment he needed to return to the capital for a while. Also, if he leaves now, he will be able to arrive in the capital by the day, which is much better. He kindly asked the girl to just wait for his return. The thought crossed her mind that Ben had asked her to wait for him after being gone for so long and without warning. Without thinking twice, the girl simply wished the guy a good journey, without answering the question of waiting. Ben realized from her ambiguous answer that he would not hear the words that she would wait for him. The slightly upset boy told Circinia that he would go change and leave. As he went to change, the witch smiled and thought that such behavior did not suit his build. At that moment, she saw something shiny on the floor in front of her, which is why she decided to pick it up and look at it. When she did this, the girl realized that it was a button from the guy's clothes. She went to the guy's room to give him what he lost. When she entered it, she said the guy's name. But at that very moment, she saw Ben's back. On it, there were many elongated and oblong scars. She immediately ran up to him and started asking him what they were and where they came from. The witch asked Ben to tell her how all those horrible scars on his back appeared. Ben looked away from the girl and carefully told her that he had received them during training. But Circinia couldn't believe it, because she couldn't even imagine such a training that would cause so many injuries. She immediately realized that the guy's words were a simple lie, because even a fool would understand that such scars would not come from training. And Ben, knowing that the witch did not believe him, continued to hide some things from her. At that moment, Ben leaned over to her and told the girl that everything was fine, and there was nothing special about the scars. After thinking for a while, Circinia silently extended her hand to the guy, in which was the button. After that, she began to think that the reason for his absence for so long was precisely because of these scars. After some time, Ben arrived at the appointed place by the crown prince, but when he saw the guy, he was unhappy. After all, the prince didn't tell anyone about Ben coming to him at dawn, because at that time he had his own plans. But he was ready to forgive the guy for this mistake if he began to come to him much more often. Without thinking twice, Ben handed Belfar a paper, which he asked him to look at and decide what to do. When the guy found out its contents, he couldn't believe that it was really true, but Ben told him to deal with the matter. The location of the base of people mentioned in the written message has already been revealed. Belfar was unhappy that the man continued his illegal activities in the empire. After prostitution, he turned to slave trading. The crown prince was also surprised at how Ben managed to carry out all this investigation. If Duke Kalos had learned about Ben's rule over the territory of his duchy, the man would definitely not have stayed away. Belfar had never seen the guy show such interest in anything before, which made him a little surprised by this behavior. He immediately assumed that he was showing it because of the girl who was there. The crown prince began to want to meet the one who could so easily control such a stern Ben. At that moment, the guy told him that Belfar should not even dare to show any interest in this girl. After these words, he was about to leave for his room, because he understood that his visit was over and his business was done. As evening began to fall, Ben rode back on his black horse to Circinia's hut, and then prepared to enter it. He entered the house and saw May crying in the kitchen, which is why he immediately ran up to her and started asking her what happened. As soon as he learned that Circinia had decided to leave, he immediately ran to the place that May had spoken of. The witch told the girl that, when the guy simply left without saying a word, he acted very unfairly. That's why Circinia wanted to go to the square, but she didn't take May because it would take her longer to walk with the girl. As Ben ran towards the square, he was haunted by nothing but a bad feeling. He prayed that nothing would happen to his Circinia during this time, and that she would be okay. At the same time, when the witch was wandering around the market, all the people present there were horrified, because they understood what she had done recently. Realizing this fact, Circinia decided that she should act confident because she hadn't even done anything. After that, she needed to make a plan, and at the very beginning, she needed to meet with Golden. Then it was possible to go to Charles, who was the one who set up this whole system of accusations. She immediately grabbed one of the guys closest to her by the shoulder and then asked him where Golden was. When she was told that he had left the village, the witch immediately became depressed because he was her main task. After all, no one except Golden could have cleared her of all these charges, which made the task much more difficult. Since Circinia was unable to contact him, she decided to go first to Charles in prison. Many people said that he was locked in the same place where he had previously locked the witch, so finding him would not be a problem. At that moment, a stone hit the girl in the head, and she saw in front of her a bunch of stupid teenagers who were aggressively disposed towards her. They shouted at her to calm her face because it made her look like a crazy killer. After which the teenagers began to laugh, imitating how she would burn everything in her path. At this time, there was only one thought in Circinia's head. She could not understand what she had done wrong. She heard the boys screaming for her to be killed because people like her didn't deserve to live. Suddenly, the evil spirit of Circinia woke up in her head, who also began to tell her that she should simply kill her offenders. She asked the girl how she came up with such an idea because it was one of the best solutions. At that very moment, a fire began to form under the girl's feet, which greatly frightened the teenagers. The boys immediately fell to the floor, gasping for breath and begging the witch for mercy because no one wanted to die. Circinia asked the body why it hesitated, since killing everyone would be better for both of them. The evil spirit began to take over the girl's body. She believed that if she destroyed everyone, then no one would neglect the body and character. Listening to all these words, the girl began to feel very strange feelings that she could not understand. She couldn't control her emotions, just like last time, uncontrollable anger flooded her mind. When Circinia got closer to the guy who injured her, he immediately started begging her not to touch him. He began to admit his guilt in everything. He was ready to do anything just to stay alive. An embittered Circinia looked at him with an ominous gaze, after which she asked him if the seriousness of it had reached him. At that moment, everything around burst into flames. People began to scream in pain and a desire for salvation. The witch immediately grabbed her offender by the throat, causing him to choke. The guy heard threatening words about how all those who decided to do this were very, very stupid. Suddenly, he noticed that the witch's behavior had changed greatly. She had a completely different energy. If people had not missed many important moments in front of their ears and eyes, there could have been a completely different outcome now. As Circinia began to feel the relief of releasing her emotions, she wondered why she hadn't done this earlier. She should not have tolerated all this, but simply burned everything. Then nothing would be able to ignore her. At this point, people started shouting at Circinia to stop and let the man go. The witch immediately came to her senses and could not understand what had weakened her body because she did not remember using her powers. Caesarinia couldn't understand why her hands were shaking so much because nothing had happened. But then she noticed that she was very angry and also felt a strong desire to kill. It was exactly the same as the day her first hut turned into a sea of fire. The strongest desire to burn and kill everyone took over, and the witch could not forget this feeling. The girls put in a lot of effort to restrain themselves and not give in to the evil spirit, but in the end, they couldn't resist. She immediately noticed the screams behind her. She turned around to see what was happening there. Then she saw a man running towards her with a rake and shouting that she should not dare touch his son. As the rake was already flying at her, the girl was knocked down by Ben, and they both flew to the ground, dodging the tool. The girl immediately looked at the guy and finally realized that this was her Ben. She was incredibly happy to see a guy in front of her, because if it weren't for him, it would be unknown what happened. At that moment, Ben asked the witch why he dared to do such a terrible thing to her. After this, the angry guy looked at the nearest man, which made him horrified. Seeing the man's reaction, Ben immediately realized that it was his doing, which made him even angrier. Realizing the danger of the situation, the man realized that it would be better to run. But the guy asked Circinia to look at him. After this, Ben began to wipe the blood from the girl's forehead and talk about how she needed medical help. He understood perfectly well that he had to protect Circinia all the time, and due to his absence, the girl received a serious injury. On this day, if he had not been there, what happened 3 years ago would have happened the same way. The witch pressed herself against the guy, after which she told him that she wanted to get home as soon as possible. Hearing the girl's request, Ben immediately picked her up in his arms and then told her that he would take her to the hut. The guy was ready to make all those who had hurt his Circinia all this time pay. At this time, the head of the village received news that Count Shorbak was exercising power in a territory that was not his own, which made the man angry. After all, according to the laws of the empire, the lord of the territory was almost the same as the emperor in his place. And Ben's actions indicated that the guy was simply ignoring the government and acting on his own free will, illegally. When the man ran to the count, he asked him what the rush was for. He began to tell the count about the whole situation, thereby asking him to help calm Shorbak's authority. The man repeated that the boy had acted illegally and had also ignored the orders of the true ruler. The Duke remembered that this guy had only recently inherited the title, but was not afraid of anything at all. The man was unhappy that this puppy simply disregarded the authority of the land ruler. He ordered his assistant to seize Ben, informing him that he would take full responsibility. The Duke could not allow the boy to be caught by him personally, because he considered it an incredible luxury, so he sent an assistant. The man was ready to show him what happens when someone touches him and his reign. The aide ordered the army to capture the Archduke. He directed them to the village of La Flèche and asked them to bring the boy to him. The group commander informed the sender that he and his teams would leave immediately. At that very moment, the man was attacked by members of another army and informed that they were obliged to arrest him. He began to shout that no one dared to touch him because the man was only following the Duke's orders. The girl immediately informed him that they also followed the order given to them, only their importance was higher because they were sent by the emperor. Sometime later, the sender was already behind bars. He could not believe that this really happened. He began to realize that his Duke had simply abandoned the man in a mean way, which left him horrified. At this time, people began to complain to the headman about the witch because, according to them, they would all eventually die because of her. Suddenly, the guy who threw the stone at her told everyone that she was not just a witch, but a real devil. He pointed to his neck. Where there was a bruise from the woman's fingers, he thought that she really wanted to kill him. The headman listened to all the complaints about the woman and thought about them carefully for some time. He understood perfectly well that all this was already causing headaches and also led to terrible consequences for his son. Much time has passed, and the head of the lands still has not given an answer to all the questions about what to do with the witch. At that moment, he told everyone that he could not act recklessly because the Archduke was protecting the witch. The Count could not even imagine what kind of relationship the Archduke and the witch had, but he understood that it was clearly not simple. If his army acted carelessly, only they and the one who sent them could suffer because of it. At this time, the army entered the office. The head reported that Dexter had sent them, after which they asked about where Ben was. The Count immediately ordered his confidant to lead the army to where the Archduke lived, after which the young man showed them the direction and led them. The elder began to understand perfectly well the fact that the guy would now come to an end because he acted illegally. At that moment, a boy entered the room and announced that he had brought tea to his master, which is why he was let in. People continued to talk about their plans. They wanted to finally finish off the witch. The boy heard about how they wanted to burn Circinia at the stake because she represented a huge danger. There was also a plan that as soon as the Archduke was captured, they would simply take and set fire to the witch's hut. After which, everyone unanimously agreed to settle on the option of burning the witch and her house in the middle of the night. The elder was ready to send a message about this to the Count himself, so that after what happened, he would write that it was an ordinary fire. Hearing all this, people began to praise the elder. All those present wanted only one thing: to punish the witch. When Ben returned Circinia to her home, May put her to bed and began to blame herself for everything that happened. At that moment, the guy took the initiative and told the girl that it was not her fault at all. He hoped that everything would be fine with his Circinia and that she would soon wake up as if nothing had happened. The guy mentally asked the girl for only one thing. He wanted her to eventually just open her eyes. At that moment, a knock on the door caught Ben's attention. He understood that no one was supposed to come that day. When he looked out the door, the boy saw knights in front of him, who asked him if he was the one they were looking for. Ben immediately asked the guys who sent them, to which they replied that they were sent to report that Dexter wanted to meet Ben. The guy answered the army that the Count could have gone to the meeting himself, since he did not want to leave this place. Ben also told the guys that his decision was immutable and he would not repeat it a second time. When the knights realized Ben's intentions, They immediately decided to run away from him without causing themselves any danger. Arzan immediately approached his master, after which he handed him a letter from the imperial palace. At the same time, Circinia finally woke up. May, realizing this, pounced on the girl and began to cry from excitement. The witch began to try to calm the girl down to ease her worries, after which she added to her that everything was fine at the moment. After some time, Ben returned to the girl's room. He approached her and asked if she was okay. After replying that everything was completely normal, Circinia turned away from Ben and said that she was going to rest. At that moment, Ben asked her again if everything was really okay because he was also worried about her. Deep down, Circinia was restless, remembering all the terrible bullying and contemptuous looks. My head was completely filled with different thoughts, which caused complete chaos. But the girl understood perfectly well that at that moment there were those with her who would always remain on her side, no matter what happened. Circinia immediately thanked the guy for being so concerned about the girl's condition even after so much time. At that moment, Ben told the girl that it was natural for him to worry about her. He immediately drew attention to the place where the wound was, after which he said that there was a scar from the wound there. The witch began to cover this place with curls of hair, after which she said that this should soon pass. Suddenly it dawned on the guy that the witch was only receiving pain all the time, which she constantly hid inside herself. He was afraid that the day might come when Circinia would not be able to bear it all and would simply break down. Because of this, Ben decided to ask the witch not to take on all this burden. After all, the guy always wanted to become her sword and shield. He was ready to be used by the girl at the right moment. Hearing these words, Circinia simply thanked Ben and looked away, because if she had looked at him, she would most likely have told him everything. She understood perfectly well that she was incredibly lonely because of her abilities, because it was precisely because of them that many feared her. That's why she needed a person who would simply be next to her, who would not be afraid of her because of her powers. Ben noticed that something was wrong with Circinia, so he gently told her that everything would be okay. He was ready to do everything to ensure that it always remained that way, no matter what. At night, the boy was going to stay with Circinia for a while, but she told him to go to bed. In this case, he wanted to return to the witch after some time to check if she had fallen asleep. As he headed to his room, Ben thought about how he could provide more joy to the girl. In order to ensure Circinia's happiness, the guy was ready to eliminate all obstacles that would stand in his way. At this moment, the knights arrived again at the witch's house. They informed Ben that the count had arrived in the capital. When the boy was taken to him, a man with assistants came out of the bushes, who had prepared everything they would need to destroy the witch. The commander immediately ordered one man to pour the contents of the barrel near the house and not to delay. But when he refused to do this, he simply snatched the barrel from the man and said that he would do everything himself. When he heard the words that the previous village was burned down because of a witch, the man replied that it was all nonsense. After the contents of the barrel were finished, the chief threw it back to the man, saying that all that was left now was to set everything on fire. But at that very moment, one of the people was grabbed by Ben's assistants, and they said that they would have to arrest everyone. At this point, the puzzled man began asking the army who they were anyway. Arzan immediately sternly asked him how he dared to treat the army so brazenly and in such a tone. When the boys grabbed him too, the man began to shout that the Archduke had left with another army for the capital. After some time, all those who were involved in the attempt to set fire to the witch's house were tied up. Everyone present could not believe that their brilliant plan had actually been discovered so easily. At that moment, the chief realized that most likely someone had reported them, after which he saw the boy who brought tea. The man immediately realized that he was the spy sent by the Duke. The man immediately started howling that he was simply following an order given to him, after which he asked not to touch him. Arzan immediately told his men to report what had happened to Count Dexter. It was necessary to inform him that from today on, he was deprived of the title of Count. The Emperor had previously granted the Archduke all rights to this territory, and the one who agreed to this move would have to pay for the sins of the former Duke. From the words that the head of the group could not believe that these words were true, Arzan decided to get the paper, after which he showed it to her with the words that no one should wait for the Emperor with news of salvation. What they did today would not have gone unnoticed either. They would have faced severe punishment. After all, they all planned to set fire to a residential building, and with such a large number of people. At that very moment, the Archduke himself arrived to the Imperial Army, and they began to greet the guy with a low bow. When he asked which of these people was Golden, the man began to justify himself and his name. He immediately shifted all responsibility onto Charles, since it was he who initially threatened everyone after his own arson of the warehouse. Ben placed his sword on Charles's shoulder and then told the man that he should have gotten rid of him earlier. After all, it was this man who dared to set up Circinia so badly in order to have her destroyed. Charles immediately began asking if Ben had any proof that he had actually done it. At the same moment, the Archduke turned to his assistant, who was attentively awaiting the order. Charles immediately saw his own things in front of him, which made him horrified because he had been exposed. There was his brooch and cape, which were found in the burnt warehouse. The man was well aware of the fact that he couldn't get out of it now, because he often wore these things. Listening to the people's discontent over what the chief's son had done, Ben asked everyone if they had anything to say. Charles, however, began to get hysterical about the fact that he would be the one to suffer because of one damn witch. When the man finished his sentence, Bell struck him on the shoulder with his sword, thereby leaving a wound, after which he told him not to blame Circinia for this. At that very moment, the leader of the bandit asked the Duke to spare all the people. He begged him to show mercy, but Ben immediately answered him that at this moment it was too late to ask for any mercy. He also reported that the one who should listen to these pleas for mercy is the victim herself. The guy could have immediately cut everyone's heads off, but he wasn't going to do it just because of Circinia. And if the group wanted mercy so much, then they should have repented to the girl for all their sins associated with her. At this moment, May screamed at the witch to wake up, which the girl did. As Circinia began to open her eyes, she heard May say that it was too noisy outside. But due to the sleepy state, when the witch was finally conscious, she asked to repeat what was outside. May told Circinia that there were most likely people outside again, which made Circinia tense. The girl immediately added that she had not seen Ben since she woke up from all the noise. When the stunned witch got to her feet, she asked May not to cry because everything was fine with them. But in my head, there were only thoughts that Ben couldn't just leave them without saying a word. At that moment, May suggested to her savior that they simply run away from this house instead of the witch going out to meet people. But Circinia asked the girl to just sit still and not follow her. The witch simply asked to trust her. The girl understood perfectly well that even if they ran away, May would still continue to worry about Circinia. She didn't want to let anyone suffer even more because of her. She immediately left the house, where she saw a large crowd of people, which made her ask Ben what was going on here. At this moment, Golden began to scream at the witch to forgive and spare him for everything that had happened. He admitted that he had given false testimony purely because Charles himself had asked him to. The witch immediately approached the man who bore all the blame, after which she grabbed him by the throat amidst all his pleas. When Charles began to ask the girl to leave him alive, she was outraged because he dared to do this after all the nastiness. At that very moment, memories that had not been there before came into her head, which is why she immediately let go of the man. Then Circinia was told that everyone thought she was a witch, so they were going to take revenge. The village representative asked the girl to show generosity, since it was just a simple misunderstanding. But then the witch told them that the decision to accept generosity or not would be hers alone. That's why she wasn't going to accept the apology, but instead took the sword from Ben and swung it. If the man really wanted to repent, he should have died. Only in this case, Circinia accepted the apology. As the sword came close to his head, Charles's pants quickly became wet, letting everyone know what had happened. Everyone immediately began to condemn the man, because he had previously behaved very proudly, and now he allowed this to happen to himself. At that moment, Circinia put away her sword and told the boy to never show his face to her again. Otherwise, she would have definitely killed him no matter what, after what was said she was about to leave. When she was with Ben, she told him that she just didn't want to get involved with them anymore because the group wasn't worth it. Arzen immediately took action. He announced that no one would be able to meet with the witch again, but instead would pay for their sins for the rest of their lives. Ben told Circinia that he was very sorry for not being able to help the girl earlier. At that moment, May looked out of the house. There were still tears in her eyes, but she realized that everything was fine. The witch immediately began to apologize for the fact that even May began to worry because of her, but the girl said that all this happened precisely because of people. Suddenly, Ben intervened in the conversation. He asked them if the girls had decided where they would go, after which he suggested that both girls go with him to the capital and stay there to live. He would be happy if the girl stayed with him, but she could also choose her own place to live. May tugged the witch's sleeve and asked her if they could go to the capital. The girl had never been there before, which made her very interested in what it was like to live there. Cercinia began to reason that staying in the capital temporarily would not be a bad option. Since the girl had been sitting quietly for 3 years, the situation had changed quite significantly compared to the original. May and Ben were pleased when the witch told them that she agreed to go to the capital. After hearing this, Ben was incredibly grateful to his Cercinia, which brought a pleasant smile to his face. In the morning, the girls were already in the capital. May was surprised at how beautiful it was. At this time, Ben watched the girls and how they were surprised by things that were ordinary for these places. After a short time, the carriage arrived at Mr. Shorbach's mansion, after which it stopped. When Cercinia and May saw this mansion, they were shocked because it was huge. At first, they thought it was an imperial palace because it looked very rich. The butler immediately appeared before them, greeted everyone, and introduced himself to Cercinia and May. Ben informed the man that the girls would be staying in the palace for a while, and also asked him to take care of them. When all three were inside, Ben offered to walk the girl to her room, since she was most likely tired after the journey, after which the guy said that May's room would be located directly opposite the witch's room. Suddenly, Cercinia asked Ben whether she should now call him more formally or not. But then the guy immediately replied that she should continue calling him Ben, because he really liked that name. Also, if the girl needed something, she could easily call Ben at any time. He added that Cercinia should not consider his manners rude, but Ben was happy to do what she asked. After all his words, the guy asked the witch to rest while leaving her new room. When Cercinia fell onto the bed, she noticed how soft it was, which also made her unable to imagine its cost. The witch understood that she had not experienced such strong calm for a very long time. At that very moment, someone knocked on the door of the room, which forced the girl to sit up. A young girl immediately joined the team and politely greeted her mistress, Cercinia. The girl also introduced herself to the new owner, after which she told her that from today on, she was a personal maid. It turned out that the maid's name was Vern. She was ready to faithfully serve and take care of the witch. The maid had ordinary dark brown hair and brown eyes, but Verna looked neat and cute. Despite her appearance, the girl exuded a strange, noble aura. There was a feeling that on her neat and tidy head there should have been a shining crown, which would have emphasized her aura. The witch immediately remembered Verna as the wife of the crown prince. She was sitting with an expensive tiara on her head and smiling nobly at everyone. Vern looked at Cercinia at this time in surprise, and the girl remembered that she was the main character of the novel. At this time, the count's assistant asked him whether the important position had made a precise decision too early. The count's presence said that it was not worth entrusting so many powers to the very young duke. But at that very moment, the duke stopped the cries of the crowd and then reported that the crown prince himself was right. Dexter had broken the law many times in the empire, and now he was against punishment from the emperor. The son, listening to everything his father was saying, understood perfectly well that after the decision was made, he could simply breathe a sigh of relief. Suddenly, the prince's assistant approached the guy and asked him if he had finished his business. He also reported that he was personally informed that the archduke himself had arrived in the capital. Not even a few hours had passed before the boy was in his new place, which amazed the prince enough. It was also known that he brought with him to the residence an unknown girl. At that moment, the crown prince realized that Ben had fulfilled his desire and had finally brought her. This girl was most likely the one Ben was so persistently looking for. The assistant began to tell the prince that he should not go anywhere, because there were currently a lot of things to do in the palace that needed to be dealt with first. But the prince said that such strong competence was a problem. There was no flexibility at all. At the same time, the guy understood perfectly well that if he wanted to see this girl's face at least once, he would have to sort things out quickly. At this point, Vernay asked Cercinia how the girl felt, because she didn't look very well. The maid was very worried about the witch. She asked the mistress about what hurt her. But at this time, Cercinia remembered that in the original this maid also worked, but it was unknown where. The girl immediately prepared to leave the room in order to call the doctor and the main owner himself. At that moment, Cercinia was thinking that if she was somehow connected to Vern, she would most likely die. She immediately grabbed her suitcase, thinking that she had to leave this place as soon as possible. But as soon as the girl wanted to go out, she ran into Ben, who excitedly asked what was wrong. He carefully asked the newly found Cercinia why she had collected so many things. Ben immediately grabbed the girl by her hand, after which he told her that he had previously asked her not to disappear without a trace under any circumstances. Because the guy was squeezing the girl's wrist too hard, she began to feel pain in it. At that moment, Ben immediately let go of the witch's hand and began to apologize to her for what he had done. Because of what happened, the guy began to think that Circinia simply wanted to take revenge on him for the fact that he disappeared for 3 years. But he couldn't let her go. He wanted to hold on to the girl even if he had to tie her up and lock her up. This is all so that Ben doesn't have to worry about the witch leaving one day, so he can fully possess her. Suddenly, Circinia put her hand on his cheek, after which she told the guy that she was not going to go anywhere. Ben sincerely hoped that the words spoken were indeed true. The thought was spinning in her head that if the guy had increased his strength, the witch's wrist would have broken. Vern soon told the boy and girl that since everything was fine, she would go and do other things. As she was leaving, she told Circinia that the girl should not be shy about calling her, because the maid was ready to come at any time. After the servants left, Ben began to apologize to the witch again, but she immediately told him to stop doing it. She also told the guy that she felt very uncomfortable when someone served her, because the girl was used to doing everything herself. She immediately corrected herself and added that she didn't need another maid, which is why she didn't even have to offer. Over the past few days, Circinia had not been able to meet with Ben, which suggested that the guy was busy with business. Also, by order of the guy, a doctor came to Circinia every day who examined the wound on her forehead. But the witch was a little upset that Ben was worried and couldn't come to her. When the doctor left, May told the girl that she hoped that she could live here forever. But Circinia replied to May that since this was not their volume, it was impossible to stay for long. Suddenly, she said that if the witch married Ben, then in this case they could stay here. At this point, Circinia was shocked, after which she responded to the girl that she and Ben were like brother and sister. But all the memories associated with the guy began to flash through her head, which made the witch think. Suddenly, she realized that much of their behavior was very different from the behavior of her brother and sister. As Circinia walked around the palace, she thought about how nice it was to be with Ben. She also thought about what one could call such a relationship between a guy and a girl. Suddenly, she saw that strange men approached Verna and held her, while the girl told them to let her go. Circinia stopped around the corner and began to listen to the conversation. Suddenly, she realized that the man was talking about Vernie seducing James. But Verna immediately began to deny this whole fact, because such a thing had never even entered her thoughts. Circinia began to remember the moments when she argued with Charles. The girl understood very well what it meant to stand alone. At that moment, the witch heard the man offering the girl a small fee for her work. Hearing these words, Verna herself decided to stand up for herself. She swung at the man and then hit him with all her might. The fallen confidant looked at the maid from below, and at that time she told him that at this rate, he would be fired. Watching what Verna did, Circinia began to remember that the original girl had a completely different character. The one who was hit by the maid stood up and began to insult the girl and even intended to swing at her. But at that moment, Circinia herself grabbed the man by the collar, thereby frightening and stopping him. Vern, seeing her mistress, was very surprised by what the girl did, because she looked defenseless. The witch immediately began to tell the man that they were acting very ugly and meanly by attacking one girl. Suddenly, one of them said something that Circinia had misunderstood, because she had only seen part of what was happening. Since Circinia herself was not a local, she could not know much about these places. As the man said, it was quite normal to maintain discipline among ordinary servants in this way. At this point, Circinia asked the man again if his job was to bully just one girl as a group, but one of them answered her that it was all so that nothing could tarnish the face of the Archduke. Suddenly, Circinia immediately squeezed the man's shoulders and asked him about opening his mouth to the wrong person. At this point, the exhausted man began to beg Circinia to just let him go and stop the abuse. The witch simply began to smile, after which she removed one hand and told the man to answer the question posed to her. After this, Circinia turned to Verna and asked her what she would like to do with these people. If a girl wanted to hit men like recently, she could do it calmly, because now nothing will happen to her. Circinia added that she would take full responsibility, which meant that Verna could afford anything. The maid thanked her mistress for what she had done, after which she began to feel embarrassed. Suddenly, Circinia sternly asked the men to state their names, after which they could not help but do so and introduce themselves. After this, the witch sent the men to do their business, at which point all three immediately ran away. Vern also bowed to Circinia and informed her that it was time for her to do the work given to her. Suddenly, Circinia asked the maid why she had so easily let the men go unpunished. After all, just recently she was ready to fight with all of them, and now it turned out like this. Because of Vern's long silence, Circinia said that if the girl did not want to speak, she did not have to. At that moment, the maid immediately told the mistress that she had let them go because she would have to continue to deal with them. Circinia immediately realized that firing these people would not change anything. What was happening now would continue to happen in the future. Varen told the witch that leaving herself would not be an option either, since she was now earning money for medicine for her mother. Tears began to well up in the maid's eyes. She understood perfectly well that she would have to work here in any case. Understanding the maid's situation, the witch decided to at least give her a handkerchief so that she could wipe away her tears. As the girl began to wipe away her tears, Circinia realized that she was talking about medication. In the original, the reason for the need for medication was that Mother had suffered multiple burns, and the medication helped to reduce the pain. Since the girl took the place of the evil Circinia, the original had to change its plot radically. At that moment, Circinia asked Verna what her mother was sick with and that medicine was needed. Vern answered the girl that her mother had severe burns, and without medication she simply could not live normally without pain. Circinia was horrified when she heard about the severe burns, because nothing like that could have happened. It turned out that some time ago, Verna returned to her home and saw her mother lying on the floor with burns and unconscious. As Vern continued to tell his story, Circinia began to stagger on her feet, forcing her to lean against the wall. Seeing that Mrs. Circinia was feeling ill, Verna immediately ran up to her and began to worry about her condition. Circinia answered her that everything was fine, she just felt dizzy. But in her mind, Circinia knew that her evil spirit couldn't do anything that was in the original, which is why her mother should be fine. The girl could not understand why everything flowed according to the original and nothing changed. Vern asked Circinia to simply lean on her so that the servant could help her. In the original, Vernay escaped from slave traders and then began working in late autumn. Suddenly the girl told the lady that her complexion was very bad and she should rest. When both girls were in Circinia's chambers, Verna brought her a blanket and asked if she needed to call a doctor. Seated, Circinia told her maid that she was now all right, and that nothing more was required of her. Suddenly, the girl asked the maid if she wanted to be with Circinia again. At first, Verna could not understand what the lady meant, so she asked her again in a form that was more understandable to her. The witch apologized to the girl, after which she told her that it was difficult for her to be alone at the moment. After which she kindly asked her if the maid could help her with everything again. Vernay was the main character of the novel. She definitely needed to be in the spotlight again. Now, Circinia's life was very different from what it had been before, but the maid's mother still received burns. The witch told the girl that she herself would ask Verna to change her job, which meant that she didn't have to worry. After both agreed, the girls agreed to help each other in all situations when it was needed. The girl had every hope that her decision would be one of the best she could have chosen. At this time, Ben was sitting with his papers and trying to work on them, and he was informed that 2 days had already passed since he had been in the palace. Arzin asked the guy why he never returned home, or why he couldn't have a normal rest. He also said about Circinia that if she applied medicine to the injury, the scar would soon disappear. Ben was incredibly happy that his Circinia was getting better and better every day, but he was also insanely afraid that one day he would lose his mind again and harm the girl. At this moment, Arzin informed his master that he was worried about his future condition. Suddenly, he asked Ben about whether something could have happened between him and Circinia that affected the guy so much. When the gentleman turned to his assistant with displeasure, Arzin realized that his question was unnecessary. But Ben simply told the guy that he needed to get his things ready for tomorrow's precautionary trip. When Arzin left, Ben began to think about how he was keeping his distance from the girl so as not to harm her. But his desire to lock the witch in his arms never went away, and because of his obsession, the guy felt disgusted with himself. Despite all these facts, Ben still missed his early days with Circinia terribly. After some time, the 3 girls went to the capital's central market, where the variety of things made their eyes run wild. Circinia told Verna that if she wanted to see something, she didn't have to be shy at all. When the maid heard and understood that she was given time off from work, her eyes lit up. The witch looked around and realized that from the village of Moulin, for example, most of the products were sent here. When the girls approached the jewelry stand, Verna was delighted by such beautiful things. When Circinia watched her, she understood that the girl had lived here for so long, but she was so surprised. It was because of this that she decided to ask the girl if it was her first time here, which turned out to be true. The maid replied that she had tried to earn money since childhood, which is why she never went to the market. When Circinia apologized for her question, Verna immediately began to talk about how everything was fine. At that moment, the witch burst into flames, and her voice was filled with a determined determination to have some fun here. May immediately ran to different benches, and the maid tried to stop her so that the girl would not fall. At this time, Circinia heard talk about precious stones, which attracted her greatly. She realized that the man was trying to sell one of his best stones to a rich woman. The woman was unsure of the value of the stone, but the guy tried his best to convince her otherwise. He showed her the radiance of his jewel, proving to her that it was definitely real. According to the man, a jewelry store would ask more than 5 million shillings for this stone. But by a lucky chance, the woman only ended up in his shop, and that is why the guy was ready to give the stone for 2 million. Suddenly, Circinia approached them and accurately named the stone, which frightened the owner of the stall. She also added that the more transparent the blood rose spinel was, the higher its value. The girl added mockingly that even jewelry stores wouldn't sell a stone like the guy's because it was very cloudy. He began to say that Circinia was talking complete nonsense, thereby trying to keep her client. But the girl told the woman that if she went into several jewelry stores, she would see for herself that her words were true. Among those presented, the stone that the guy showed had the lowest price. The woman realized that she should from now on avoid buying suspicious things in unknown places. She wanted to call her guards so that they could help her check the value of this stone. But at that moment, the woman decided to thank Circinia for helping her instead of passing her by. In her head, the girl understood that now she should no longer show her name, which is why she did not want to name it. After which, she simply got ready to leave the woman, having first informed her that it would not be difficult to help her. At that moment, she realized that it was Circinia who was beginning to interest her more and more. When the witch was looking for Vern and May, an unknown person followed her. But the girl did not notice it. Soon the girl was already with her friends. She asked them if they liked the walk. The girl joyfully and admiringly told her savior that the capital was incredibly beautiful. After the girls responded positively, Circinia told both of them that they would go out more often in the future. But there were many questions in his head about why Ben could not come out to the other's eyes, although he was in the mansion. She had also previously heard that he was in a small mansion that was used as a storage room. Vern also did not know where the gentleman was, but she knew that Arzan visited his lordship every morning. May asked the witch if anything could have happened to the Archduke during this time. Also, Circinia didn't know if Ben could leave her and just go to another palace for a while. She began to realize that Ben had disappeared after the very day she wanted to leave, as if he was avoiding her. At this moment, Circinia is very surprised by Verna's words that the girl and the Archduke met. May asked the maid again what she had just said, because she could not believe what she had heard. After that, she turned to the witch and asked her about when her relationship with Ben had progressed so much. At that moment, Verna realized that she had made a huge mistake, which is why she began to apologize to Circinia. She explained her thought by the fact that many people said that the guy and the girl were dating, which is why she thought so. Suddenly, Circinia stood up from her seat and said that she needed to go out onto the terrace for a short while. Vern began to blame herself for ruining everything again with her unnecessary words, but May began to calm her down. The maid covered her face with her hands and said that she really didn't know that they weren't in a relationship. On the day when the Lady of Ciricnia became ill and the girl told her master about it, the guy immediately put aside all his business and ran to her. Anyone would think that this is what a person who is worried about his beloved looks like. At this time, the witch stood and thought about the fact that there were some rumors that she did not know about. She didn't want to have to justify herself every day and refute the rumor that she and Ben weren't a couple. The witch began to get annoyed by the fact that at the moment she was not worried about her future, but about Ben's beloved, who did not yet exist. At that moment, the girl saw several more people behind her and was outraged because she was just going to be alone. When the girls started talking about the Archduke and his illness, Circinia didn't understand what they were talking about. She suggested that the illness they were talking about was related to the injuries to the boy's back. The lady said that he had been in the hospital ward since he was a child, so it was not strange that he lost consciousness again. Upon hearing this news, Cercinia was very surprised because she did not understand what the girls were talking about. But when Ben returned completely healthy for the Crown Prince's birthday, all the people were surprised. Cercinia couldn't even imagine that she and the girls had in mind the same person. She knew Ben as a guy who lived alone with his mother and ended up living as a slave for several years. Ben, who had disappeared from Cercinia so abruptly in the end, appeared before her as the Archduke. It all seemed like the duchy was deliberately spreading rumors about Ben's past. Most likely this was done because the past of a slave would not be compatible with the title of Archduke. At that moment, Cercinia heard the girls start discussing the fact that Ben had brought a girl with him to the mansion. They talked about how the Duke himself personally accompanied her, and after that, he even ordered the servants to take care of her. The ladies wondered if anyone knew what lineage the girl was from, which surprised Cercinia. She heard that the girls began to assume that the witch was an ordinary commoner. The girls were desperate to see the face of this girl he had brought to the mansion, and Cercinia was already eager to show herself to them. But after that, she realized that this was not worth doing, which is why she decided to just leave so that no one would see her. Cercinia returned back to the maid and May. She asked them how long they had been waiting for her, to which she received a negative answer. The witch told May about what the terrace was like, which made the girl want to look at it even more. As the girl ran away, she hoped that the remaining girls would be able to talk about the situation, because Verna was very depressed. Suddenly, the witch asked the maid what she had heard about the Duke's childhood, to which she replied that he had been ill all his childhood. It was also because of his illness that the boy never appeared in high society. Hearing the testimony, Cercinia began to be convinced that this disease was just a deception for people. 6 months ago, when the Archduke finally got back on his feet, that day all the servants were abruptly replaced with others. It was then that all the old workers were fired, thereby making room for new workers. But Ben said that he was taken to the duchy 3 years ago, which is why the servants should have been replaced even earlier. It would be strange to hide the boy from the servants, and even more so to receive lessons from the successor. It also turned out that the butler Morin, like everyone else here, started working quite recently, although at first glance it doesn't seem so. The previous butler had served the previous duke, but had retired due to his poor health. Suddenly Verna remembered that it was Arzin who was currently working the most for the Archduke. After hearing a hint from Verna, Cercinia decided that she needed to meet with Ben's assistant as soon as possible. When the witch was heading to meet Arzin, she was watched by an unknown person who had been looking for the girl for a long time. Several days later, Cercinia continued to search for any clues related to Ben. The girl questioned all the servants in the palace thoroughly, but they also knew nothing about it. She reasoned that since no one could give her an answer to her question, then Arzin really was the last one left. A week has passed since Ben disappeared from his own palace, and the guy still hasn't shown up in front of the girl. As the butler told the witch, Ben and Arzin went to inspect the territory together. At this time, Cercinia remembered how the guy used to tell her about all his plans, which was not the case now. The girl was outraged that Ben couldn't even return home just to eat normal food. The witch understood that there was a high probability that he could appear to her at least for a short time. But suddenly she realized that she had no reason to think about such things, because she was not Ben's wife or girlfriend. Cercinia considered herself crazy because she forgot her head with such thoughts, which only made her upset. At this time, the weather began to become colder and colder, and late autumn gradually arrived. During this period, in the original novel, the Crown Prince and Vernet were supposed to meet. Their meeting happened suddenly. The prince was simply looking around the capital, but at one point he had to save the girl from danger. Suddenly, Cercinia saw how the butler was refusing the request of an unknown girl. But the man replied to the beautiful girl that he would simply pass on her information to Erngerzog himself. Aronia was a beautiful and pleasant girl. She was noble and well-mannered. Cercinia noticed that at one point the aristocrat raised her gaze specifically to her, thereby embarrassing the girl. After which, she immediately switched to talking to the butler and informed him that it was time to leave. At this point, Cercinia approached him and asked who this girl was in general. Mercian introduced Aronia and also reported to the witch that she was Blewan's only daughter. She could also be the one who calmly claims the place of the future bride of his lordship. When the man began to walk away from Cercinia, she began to suspect that there was something wrong with the man's behavior. But the girl understood perfectly well that she had only been in the mansion for a week, which is why she could not become a close person so quickly. She was well aware of the fact that no one was happy to see her here, except Ben Circinia was a stranger to most. That is why the witch believed that it would be much better and easier for her to live alone and not stick her neck out. At that moment, Vernie appeared. The maid was incredibly happy to see her mistress, which is why she approached her. It turned out that she thought, due to the reason for Circinia's long absence, that the witch was simply lost. At this time, Ben asked Arzin about how many days later the beloved Harvest Festival was supposed to take place. It was a festival where everyone gave thanks to the earth for the harvest and then prayed for prosperity for the next year. After the Duke learned the date, he told his assistant that if anything was needed for the festival, it had to be taken care of. Suddenly, the guy began to notice people's surprised looks at him, after which he realized that people were uncomfortable with the sight of the Lord. As Ben went to a quiet place, he began to think about the fact that he had not seen his Circinia for 10 days. He understood that the more he didn't see her now, the more he began to yearn for the girl. But he also couldn't even stop thinking about her, which only made his condition worse. Ben covered his face with his hands and quietly said that he missed Circinia very much. Suddenly, a strong motivation came into his head, which made him decide to see the witch as soon as possible. At that moment, the guy met his assistant, who reported to him what he had managed to do today. But Ben didn't listen to Arzin about this. Instead, the guy just jumped on his horse and was about to leave. When he was in his palace, the servants immediately decided to serve the master, but he said that there was no need to do this now. A couple of minutes later, Ben was already near Circinia's room. He stood in front of her and began to think whether the girl was already asleep. But when he opened the door, he realized that there wasn't even a witch's spirit in his own room, which was surprising. At that moment, Ben panicked that the witch had decided to disappear again without even saying a word. But suddenly, the guy heard steps behind him, which made him decide to turn around, after which he saw Circinia in front of him. Ben couldn't understand why the girl wasn't in her room, after which he gently took her by the shoulder and felt the warmth. He immediately calmed down when he realized that the witch had not gone away from him, which is why he pressed the girl to himself. After some time, the Duke carefully laid Circinia down on her soft bed in her room. Ben realized that the girl had not changed at all since the last time he saw her. She was just as beautiful. The guy considered the witch to be the kind of person who was insanely charming, which is why it was impossible not to love her. But he also understood perfectly well that he could not continue to be near the girl, because he was afraid of causing harm. Ben took Circinia by her hand and carefully said that he was terrified of losing her or hurting her in any way. At that moment, he noticed that the witch began to open her eyes, thereby frightening Ben a little. The girl woke up from hearing a familiar and dear voice, after which she saw the guy himself. Suddenly, she asked him that it was precisely because of the fear of harming her that Ben avoided Circnia. She asked the guy to tell her the exact reasons why he tried so hard to avoid meeting her. When Ben replied that he couldn't be sure that Circnia wouldn't be harmed, he didn't give a definitive answer. Suddenly, Circnia told the guy that she was not one of those who would have to be protected in difficult times. But at that moment, Ben corrected himself, adding that he was simply afraid that his own desires would burden the girl. The Duke covered his face with his hands and then thought about how he could not contain his ever-growing desires. He was afraid to imagine the girl's reaction to the fact that he was ready to keep her next to him, even if he had to break the girl's wings. Suddenly, the witch reminded Ben that no one would be able to touch her because of her abilities. After speaking the words, the witch asked the guy to just turn around and look at her. When he turned to the girl, she immediately asked him if she looked like someone who could be easily broken. From the moment the boy smiled at her on the dock and told her that he wanted to be together, Ben became Circinia's salvation. Suddenly, the girl told the Duke that she knew perfectly well that he could not harm her at all. And if this were to happen, Circnia would not even think about starting to despise the guy. That's why she asked the guy not to be afraid of something that hasn't even happened yet, because at the moment, it's meaningless. When Ben saw the fire coming from Circinia's hands, he immediately realized that all his antics were stupid. The witch always had the power to defend herself, and she could also deal with her wounds with ease. At this point, Circinia asked Ben why he was avoiding her if he had brought her here himself earlier. Ben told the witch that he just wanted to be greedy, to which he received the answer he expected. Suddenly, he took Circinia's hand and tenderly confessed his feelings for her, thereby surprising her. After which, the Duke told the girl that since it was already late, he would no longer disturb her sleep. Ben's confession was just in the air from that moment on, but he knew that if he wanted to hear sincerity, he didn't need to rush. That's why the guy suggested that the girl have breakfast together the next morning if she didn't have any plans. When Ben left, Circinia fell back onto the bed and covered her face with her hands. She was very embarrassed and stunned by the guy's confession. She tried in every way to bring her thinking back to normal, but she could not do it. At this moment, one man came to his commander and apologized for returning from his mission so late. Suddenly, the woman told her subordinate that she had seen quite a lot today. Because she saw a completely healthy Circinia, she couldn't look at it calmly. She wanted to take everything from the girl. In the morning, Verna entered the witch's room, and the lady asked her to inform Ben that she was unable to come to breakfast. After the maid left, Circinia began to reason that avoiding the guy was not an option now. She was tormented by many questions, but the most important thing she was interested in was since when Ben liked her. She decided to dig into her memories, where the guy constantly smiled tenderly at the girl, making her heart flutter. Previously, the witch had not even imagined that Ben could like her, despite the fact that he had said countless times that he wanted to be together. The boy tried to stay close even after he became Archduke, which made Circinia wonder how she hadn't noticed it before. The witch realized that she was simply pretending that she knew and understood nothing, thereby making her life easier. Most likely, she did this because of her own fear that their relationship would change for the worse in the future. But for the witch, now was not the time to play love, since the original plot had already begun at the moment she could not be allowed to give her heart to someone. At that moment, Ben knocked on the door of the room and asked her if he could come in to see her at that moment. Circinia said she needed time, and then immediately ran to wash and prim herself. When she was mostly ready, she stood in front of the mirror and wondered if she should put on lipstick now. But then she came to her senses and began to get furious that she had become so worried about how best to appear before Ben. The witch gave up her desire to put on makeup and simply walked to the door, after which a smartly dressed duke entered the room. The moment Circinia saw the guy, she wondered why he looked so handsome today. Suddenly he reported to his beloved girl that because of the upcoming holiday, he wanted to spend it with her. In this way, he asked for a date, but immediately added that if the witch did not want it, she could simply refuse. Due to the girl's long silence, Ben assumed that she was refusing, after which he decided to leave, but Circinia stopped him. She immediately told Ben that she agreed to go with him to the upcoming harvest festival. The guy immediately turned around, and the girl began to assume that if she had not taken his hand, he would have moved away. A little surprised, Ben smiled tenderly at Circinia, then carefully squeezed her thin hand. The next morning, the girl was woken up by May and Vern, and the witch had to reluctantly get up early in the morning. They kept telling Circinia that they needed to start right now so that they could prepare properly. The witch immediately regretted telling the girls about going to the party with Ben himself. After some time, the maid told Circinia that she was simply beautiful in such outfits. After this, May added that the Archduke had said that he would be waiting for his girlfriend at the door. When Circinia came out to the guy, it was impossible to tear her eyes away, which embarrassed the witch quite a lot. As soon as she was about to go down to the guy, she tripped, which caused her to fly towards Ben, but he caught her. After some time, Circinia and the Archduke arrived at the village where the festival was being held. When the boy extended his hand to the witch to help her, she was lost in thoughts about how she needed to somehow reject Ben. But also in the last moments, she just wanted to forget about everything and enjoy the holiday no matter what. The girl was quite surprised when she saw a large number of people who had come to the square. At that moment, Ben called the girl to him and offered her berries and syrup. Such a treat was made only in this village. Some fruits were simply covered with sweet syrup, and then you just had to wait for it to harden. Embarrassed, Circinia took the treat and thanked Ben, then informed him that it was indeed delicious. Suddenly the guy told the girl that she was dirty, after which he carefully wiped the syrup off her face, thereby embarrassing her. And Ben noticed that the finger with which he touched the girl's lips became too hot. Sometime later, the guy threw his jacket over the witch, telling her that it was quite chilly today. He was just worried that Circinia might get sick from today's walk, so he decided to take care of her. In the evening, a large bonfire was to be lit in the square, thus holding a large ceremony. Ben asked Circinia if she would mind going there. In theory, if they went there, they would return only by dawn, but the witch did not know what to answer. After a while, Circinia noticed the bracelets and immediately pointed them out to Ben. At this point, the saleswoman began to admire the guy and the girl, because they chose colors that matched each other. These bracelets would be perfect for both of them as gifts to each other. Cercinia told Ben that she liked both bracelets, so she told the guy to choose for himself. Hearing these words, the Archduke told the girl that in that case he was ready to take the red one. At this time, the Crown Prince was outraged that as soon as he finished work, he learned that the two he was looking for had simply left for the festival. When the assistant asked the gentleman whether he wanted to return to the palace because of this act, the prince answered in the negative. After some time, the guy turned his attention to a thing made by a professional from the village of Briand, after which he turned to Eric with the message that they absolutely had to buy this thing, despite the fact that the prince had many such things. When the man began to try to contradict the prince, he said that in this case, it would have been worth buying another wardrobe. At that moment, he noticed that a group of men had once again followed one of the girls. It was Verna. The men were threatening her again, and besides, no one could help the girl here, which played into the hands of these people. One of them started shouting that because of the maid, the whole trio had to suffer for several days. The prince watched in horror as these men were about to do something to the girl, and the leader of the company ordered the others to seize Verna. The heir immediately rushed to help the maid. He began to shout at the men that with their actions they only showed their lowered status. When men started attacking him, he easily fought back against his attackers. He also told them to attack all at once and not waste his time. After the heir had easily laid all the men on the ground, he said that his guess had been proven correct by their false masculinity. A few seconds later, he said that all 3 men would have 3 seconds to leave here in one piece. If they didn't make it in time, the whole torture would go in a circle. As the 3 ran away, Verna shyly thanked the boy for what he had just done for her. Suddenly he asked the girl about the relationship between her and Cercinia, whom he so wanted to see. Verna couldn't understand how this guy knew Cercinia herself because she didn't shine with her name in the capital. When Verna told him that she was not obligated to answer the guy because of her distrust of him. But she tried to continue the conversation calmly, which is why she asked the guy again why he needed the witch. In the evening, while Ben and the Cericia were sitting quietly and waiting for the main concert to begin, the stage preparations for it began. But the witch's attention was riveted to the bracelet she had bought that day. She could not tear her gaze away from it. Also, the more she looked at him, the more he reminded her of Ben because of his dark shades. As she spent more and more time with the guy, it became more difficult for her to refuse. Cercinia was desperate to lose and simply let go of the connection that was so precious to her and Ben. She was afraid mostly because if she suddenly refused him, she would never be able to see the guy again. At this moment, the participants of the performance came out to the people, holding flaming torches in their hands. The performance began, as well as the ceremony of sacrifice itself in gratitude to the earth. The sight of the fire made the witch feel worse and worse. Horror began to appear in her eyes, and memories of her impending death began to run through her head. Ben himself immediately noticed all this. He told the girl that she had turned pale, which is why he himself began to panic. She began to reject the guy's assumptions about what could have happened to her, but with each passing second, it only became more difficult for the girl. At that moment, the Archduke told Cercinia that they would have to leave the concert immediately, and then asked her again what had happened. But the witch could not answer this question. She clearly felt that she was beginning to get goosebumps from the desire to kill. At the same time, she heard an emotionless female voice in her head, the sensation of which made her feel jittery. She also remembered her smile, which lit up the girl's face during the time when the Viscount almost died because of the fire. And also the face of the one who, standing in the center of the square where the celebration in honor of the Thanksgiving ceremony was taking place, smiled, covered in blood. It was Cercinia, who was the very person who with just one appearance could evoke darkness and horror. The girl could not understand where she was and where that same evil Cercinia was already beginning. She was incredibly scared that at one moment her evil essence could manifest itself again. Cercinia was also afraid that in her unconscious state, she could somehow harm Ben himself. Suddenly, despite her fear, the witch turned to the guy, to which he quickly reacted and took her hands. At that very moment, the Archduke told the girl that he really wanted to help her in some way, as well as protect her. To fulfill his desire, he needed the appropriate position, which is why he wanted to spend the future with her. Suddenly, the saddened witch removed her hands from his, looked away, and told the guy that she did not share his feelings. When she saw Ben's saddened face, her heart bled greatly from pity and shame of what she had done. Ben asked her why he couldn't be with her. He could have just waited for the right moment. But the girl understood perfectly well that she couldn't come apart in front of such a guy. After several further requests, the witch gave a final refusal, also saying that it was no longer up for discussion. But Ben couldn't understand why the witch acted this way, because he never looked at other girls. He leaned on the witch's shoulder and began to beg her to give him some time so that she would finally accept him. The Archduke began to cry so that the girl would at least not disappear suddenly, as she could have done earlier. But she simply took off the guy's jacket, gave it to him, and said that it was now time for them to leave. In the morning, the girl thought about how sad Ben's face was, which made her feel incredibly ashamed. She mentally asked the Archduke to be able to take care of himself after what had happened. At that moment, Verney entered the lady's room and said that she was worried about her because of her poor appearance. The maid assumed that Saracenia's condition had worsened after the festival, since she had been feeling unwell before. But the witch said that everything was fine, and she was also going to go for a walk, because the weather was nice outside. At that moment, she asked Vern if she wanted to go for a walk with her. When they went outside, the maid really wanted to ask what happened to the girl and the master. But realizing that this issue could end badly, she simply reported to the witch that the Duke would be leaving on business today. Sarsinia suggested that Ben could not return to his home because he was afraid of inconveniencing the witch. But he could also come to it calmly, because this palace was his home, and the girl was just a guest. Soon the girls came to a place where they could have a snack and drink tea. The maid said that she would bring sweets right away. As she left after them, the witch wondered when it would be best for her to leave this palace. But in my head, there was a thought about what Ben had asked earlier, or rather, not to leave him without saying a word. She also thought about the fact that the girl never found out about the scars on his back that Ben didn't want to talk about. Then Sariznia saw Arzen approaching her. He came up to her and asked her if he could sit down next to her. When he sat down opposite her, the witch wondered why he decided to sit there, since the guy wasn't even looking for her. Suddenly, she told Arzen that she had already heard about the upcoming trip, as well as about their busy schedule. But at that very moment, Ben's assistant addressed the girl more seriously, thereby causing her to feel confused. He told the witch that recently something strange had begun to happen to his master because he had stopped eating normally. Arzen understood that it was shameless to say this, but he asked the girl to help the gentleman with this. But suddenly Sarisnia told Arzen that at the moment it was no longer in her power, no matter what she did. At that moment, the assistant told her that he considered himself a sinner because he most of all wanted his master's happiness. He was also incredibly ashamed that it was he who had kidnapped the guy several years ago, for which he would now serve the guy forever. At that moment, Sarsinia began to remember Ben's words about him being kidnapped by a man who served the Archduke. Sarsinia told Arzen that all the true information about Ben was hidden behind his spring illness, after which the girl asked why they took the guy back to the duchy, since he was a slave. The witch also very well emphasized to Arzen that she saw many scars on Ben's back. But after hearing the latest news, the assistant said that he had no right to report anything else to the girl. Since Arzen was a man of his lordship, he had no right to tell any information about him without permission. Sarsinia, having understood the whole situation, told the assistant that in this case she would not ask anything else. After this, the guy thanked her, and also again asked her to think about his shameless request. It turned out that Ben wanted to go back to the girl every day, but Arzen could not do anything about it. As he began to walk away from the witch, her head was filled with thoughts about what had happened to Ben at that moment. The memories were most likely so painful that he hid them. Before she left, she wanted to find out what happened to Ben and also help with whatever she could. After some time, Vern and Sarsinia tried to find out at least some information, but could not find anything. At the same moment, when the girls left the first place, someone called out to Sarsinia, which surprised both girls. Vern, when she saw the man who called her, was very surprised, because she could not have expected such a turn of events. Suddenly, she told the witch that now it would be best for the girls to run away as quickly as possible. She was ready to explain the whole situation later, but now they needed to get their feet to a safe place. At this point, the guy asked both girls if he really looked so repulsive. When the witch began to examine him, she realized that the guy's face was familiar enough to her, but she could not understand who it was. But then she noticed how luxurious this guy's clothes were, after which she immediately realized that the crown prince himself was standing in front of her, which is why she immediately bowed to him. At that moment, he asked her how the witch herself could know the prince, since she had never been to the capital before. But then she asked him how many people in the empire could wear the coat of arms on their clothes. Suddenly, Verna fell on her knees before the prince and began to beg for forgiveness because she simply did not recognize his majesty. Cercinia asked the maid to calm down because the crown prince himself said that he had forgiven the girl. A few minutes later, the guy told the girl that he would like both girls to pay him some attention. Surprised and also a little tense, Cercinia looked at him attentively and was ready to listen to the prince. At this time, Ben was walking along the shores of a wonderful lake where the sun flooded everything with its bright rays. It shone just like his beloved Cercinia, which made Ben want to come to this place with her. Looking at his reflection in the water, Ben thought about how much longer he would be so strongly attached to the witch. Suddenly, Arzan himself ran up to him, hurrying to report some news. At that moment, he informed the Duke that the Crown Prince himself had arrived at Ben's mansion, and most likely the heir first met Lady Cercinia, which is why the panic began. At the same time, the witch and the heir were already sitting at the table and drinking tea, talking a little about each other. Cercinia sat and wondered why Remathius Belfell had come to the Ernduke's palace. The girl also couldn't believe that she was now sitting and calmly drinking with someone who could easily destroy her. The heir told the girl that he had heard a lot about her thanks to the Archduke. When the guy asked her how the situation in the village was resolved, the girl was very surprised. It turned out that Ben came to him at dawn and immediately began to threaten him because the ruler did not have time to deal with matters. He asked the girl if she knew that Earl Dexter had simply been stripped of his title because of what had happened. No one except the emperor had authority over the ruler of a foreign territory, and this was also punishable. What the Archduke did could be considered as him brazenly declaring war against the rulers of the territory. Cercinia understood that the timely deprivation of the title by Count Dexter simply noted the fact of Ben's future punishment. Also, most likely, it was the heir who arranged and took care of everything that happened in the village. After all, with only the Archduke's power, Ben simply wouldn't have been able to carry out his entire plan. For Cercinia, it was just an unpleasant memory until that moment. She hadn't even thought about the seriousness of it. At that moment, Belfar announced that he was not as interested in this as he was in the girl herself. An enraged Ben immediately appeared next to them and immediately stopped the heir, also very angry with him. It turned out that the Crown Prince came to the duchy for only one reason, and that was all because of his interest in seeing Cerysnia. Suddenly, Ben asked the girl to make room for him because he wanted to talk to Belfar about some things. At that moment, Cercinia asked the guy not to do anything serious, after which she left both of them. A few seconds later, Ben asked the Crown Prince again, more sternly, what he was doing there. Belfar noted that the Archduke clearly had no intention of discussing the name Cerysnia had given him. Suddenly, the boy said that he was ready to talk about the witch, although he did not expect the Duke to have such high standards. At that moment, Ben, having calmed down, said what he had previously warned the heir more than once, not to even look in Cercinia's direction. Belfar said that other people's women didn't interest him, and then asked why he hid her so diligently. The Crown Prince said that in the future, such hide-and-seek could lead to serious consequences. Any envious person could easily target this girl, thereby putting not only her at risk. Suddenly, Ben asked Belfar how he should accept these words, but his interlocutor replied that it was simply concern. The heir asked Ben where Verdict was, since he had only met Mercian before. The old butler was under guard. It was in the most impassable place, from where there was definitely no escape. Belfar noticed that the Duke had been very pale lately, even though he lived in the flower garden, but he himself seemed to be drying up. Because Ben didn't want to answer the question of what had happened to him, the heir simply told him to contact him if anything happened. The next morning, Verna told the lady that she needed to go to the store, during which time the witch could sit in the cafe. After the girl left, Cercinia began to think about the maid's words about what the Crown Prince did for her on the day of the festival. Although the details were radically different, the overall fact of their first meeting was the same as in the original novel. After their meeting, the story should have started to develop much faster, which was bad for the witch. That was why the girl had to sort everything out as quickly as possible in order to leave the capital after that. When the witch was in the cafe, she was upset that she would not be able to learn the information she needed from the conversations of the aristocrats. At that moment, she had to think about where she should go to get more of what she needed. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a news agency, which she wanted to go to in order to find out what she was interested in. At that moment, a person unknown to her touched her, which Cercinia immediately noticed and began to act. She grabbed the man by the hand and began to question him about who he was. When the man took off his hood, the witch immediately realized that it was the crown prince, after which she immediately let go of the guy's hand and apologized for considering him suspicious, which made her rude. Belphar reported to Circinia that he could provide her with all the information she needed. After all, she couldn't find anyone better than him as an informant anywhere else. He knew any information, even that which was outside his place of rule, for example about Shorbach. Circinia thanked the guy for his help, but told him that she would be forced to refuse this offer. Suddenly, the heir asked the girl not to use news agencies under any circumstances so as not to waste money. Since the girl had not yet entered the building, Belphar was ready to tell her some information. He told the lord that there was a secret place in the Archduke's house that was difficult to penetrate. It was a very deep and dark place, hidden from human eyes, which is why difficulties arose. At that moment, Circinia asked the heir why he was telling her all this. If the girl had trusted him, she would have immediately understood how true the prince's words were. After this, he told Circinia that he had to go since the same lady who had been with her earlier was not there. Suddenly, Circinia let it slip that her maid had gone shopping for some things. Belphar asked the witch where the girls had agreed to meet after she returned from the store. As Circinia sat in the heir's carriage, her thoughts were filled with how the relationship between the prince and Vern would develop further. She immediately noticed how somehow, without realizing it, she had gotten caught up in this whole picture between the lovers. The atmosphere between the crown prince and Vern was becoming sweeter with each passing minute, even though they had only just met. The very next day, Circinia and the other girls went in search of the secret room. The witch tried to understand from the heir's words where this place could be located. A deep and dark place in the mansion, it definitely had to be something like a dungeon. Wherever the three girls looked for something similar to what was described, no one could find anything at all. Circinia also wanted to just despair and believe that the crown prince had simply lied to her. Suddenly, the girls suggested that the others split up and look for the passage separately, because that way they would find it faster. But at the same time, she still hoped that in this way she would not waste time in vain, continuing her search. At this moment, as she walked in front of the door of the hall, she saw Aronia Blenwan standing inside, which surprised her a little. Then she saw that Ben himself was with the girl, which made the witch wonder what they were doing there without the servants. And after that, I realized that Aronia tried to smile as brightly as possible in front of the Archduke. Circinia wondered if Ben knew how two-faced and vile this aristocrat was. She suddenly wondered why she was even interested in this, since she had rejected Ben. Since she did this, it was childish behavior on her part, which is why the girl should not have done it. When the witch looked at the girl, she wondered what the boy and girl were talking about. But then, Circinia realized that it was better to look at Ben's reaction to understand the approximate speech of the conversation. At that moment, May approached the witch from behind, causing her to become very frightened by the unexpected approach. The girl asked the girl in surprise whether she had been spying on the Duke and the aristocrat. When May looked through the crack with Circinia, she saw Aronia there, which made her smile very slyly. Suddenly, the witch noticed the way the Archduke was smiling, which made her disappointedly tell May to leave with her. At that moment, Ben stood up and noticed that someone was either standing behind the door or walking past. The guy also clearly heard some girl calling Circinia to her. Suddenly, he noticed that the scent of the witch herself remained in the corridor. A couple of minutes later, the Duke returned to talking with Aronia, which prompted her to ask him what had happened. When Ben sat down opposite the girl, she immediately saw how the Duke's face changed. It became indifferent again. She immediately remembered that when the topic of the bracelet came up, Ben smiled at least a little. For the first time in her life, Aronia was able to see such a bright and sincere smile from the Archduke. At this point, she decided to bring up the bracelet topic again and told the guy that she was very surprised to learn that he wore bracelets. But at that very moment, she simply received a refusal to talk from Ben. He told her to go to her place. When both girls were already in their chambers, May asked Circinia why she broke the handle, after which she carefully began to tease the witch about how she got angry because Ben smiled at another girl. After many repeated questions, the witch actually thought about what made her so angry. Most likely, this happened because the guy had never shown this facial expression to anyone before, which made her angry. When May told Circinia that she was simply jealous of Ben, the girl immediately became very indignant at her. But at that very moment, the girl said that it was clear from Circinia that she really liked Erngerzog. Suddenly, the witch began to suggest that the girl go to the market and look at new things, thereby distracting her from the topic. When May was no longer in the witch's chambers, she wondered why she couldn't immediately refute her words. But she also thought about why she wanted Ben to smile so sincerely only at her. His face continued to turn red when they met even after she rejected the guy, which made the witch feel ashamed. Even if Circinia wanted to be with Ben, she had already made her decision anyway. After nightfall, the witch realized that her water had run out at the most inopportune moment and then went to collect it. But when she returned to her room, she saw Ben standing in front of her, putting his hand on the door. The guy stood carefully in front of her, his eyes downcast and thinking about something. His face looked quite sad. Realizing that it was indeed Ben, Circinia wondered what he was doing there since everyone was already asleep. At this point, the Duke quietly began to say words about how he was very worried about her, because anything could happen to her. The girl immediately fell to the floor, and immediately thought about the consequences of what she had done to Ben. A few minutes later, the guy left too, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. She realized that she couldn't look him in the eye, and immediately remembered her state 3 years ago, which was very similar to Ben's state. Every day, Circinia then hoped that the guy would soon return with his wonderful smile. It was at this moment that the witch began to realize that she was madly in love with the guy, but she rejected him. The very next morning, the 3 girls again gathered to go in search of that very place. This time, Verna was to go alone in the opposite direction, and Circinia and May set off along the route they had devised, looking at every detail along the way. Suddenly, May asked the girl if she was okay, surprising her savior. At that moment, Circinia reminded the girl of their conversation yesterday, to which May replied that the witch denied everything. As suddenly she told the girl that she was right at that moment. Circinia really loved Ben. Upon hearing this wonderful news, May was immediately delighted that she was indeed right. But suddenly the witch confessed to the girl that she had just recently refused Ben, which is why they could no longer date. She did this in order not to harm Ben himself in any way, because the girl knew very well how they lived before. At that moment, May told the witch that she should at least once try to think only about her feelings. Suddenly, the witch really thought about the fact that she never thought only about her feelings. She just tried to save more people. All she thought about most often was not to harm Ben, because she felt very sorry for the guy. From the moment the girl became Circinia, the only thing she dreamed of was to become ordinary. In the morning, Ben woke up and began to realize that he was having very bad nightmares for the umpteenth time. At that moment, Arzen approached, and the Duke asked him to call a doctor so that he could give him a good sleeping pill. Suddenly, the assistant added information to Ben that Circinia had already had breakfast and gone for a walk. There was only one thing on the guy's mind. He was relieved that the girl continued to stay by his side. The Archduke began to suspect that everything that was happening had started because of his request. The guy was very irritated by his own selfishness, but he was glad that he was leaving the witch at least like this. At this time, Circinia was again looking for a place where there could be a secret passage, but she could not find even something similar. Suddenly, she realized that most likely the Crown Prince was simply making fun of her very badly. The witch was very unhappy that people's feelings were just an ordinary joke for him. At that moment, she saw a passage that she had never seen before, which is why she decided to see what was there. When she walked into this place, her attention fell on the fact that this particular part of the palace was very, very dirty. At the end of the corridor, there was an ordinary dead end, to which Circinia also turned her attention. Suddenly, an incomprehensible passage appeared before the girl, which only increased her interest. Beyond this passage was a staircase that led to a dark basement, the beginning of which was not even visible. At that moment, one of the servants approached the witch and began to tell her that outsiders were not allowed to enter there. After all, it was not a place where anyone could go, even if it was very interesting. Suddenly, this maid pushed Circinia into this darkness, which made the girl unable to stop. She landed already at the bottom of the stairs, and in front of her she saw the closing door. At that moment, the maid shouted at her that she should not even dare to pretend to be the mistress, because the girl was a stranger to everyone. That is precisely why this dungeon would be the perfect place for her, because no one will remember her here anymore. After a while, the witch stood up and said that pushing people down the stairs was tactless and rude, after which she lit a fire with her hand in order to illuminate the path at least a little. Circinia also noticed that it was very cold and damp under the mansion, which was not even possible to imagine. She also began to wonder why this basement was needed at all, since there was nothing there. After some time on the road, the witch saw many cells in front of her, which surprised her greatly. But I immediately realized that this place was a prison, even though there was no one here who deserved this punishment. The girl wondered why the Crown Prince had told her about this place. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to one camera, from the appearance of which it was clear that someone had been there just recently. After this, the girl noticed the rods hanging on the wall, after which she wondered what they were doing there. As a result of being hit with such whips, the perpetrators most likely were left with various elongated scars on their bodies. Suddenly, Circinia remembered Ben's words about how he got his scars during some of his training. When she realized that these rods had most likely been used to beat Ben, she immediately threw them aside in horror. Suddenly, she heard strange rustling and sounds behind her, which made the girl wary. It turned out that in one of the prison cells there was a weak and thin man who was muttering something under his breath. The man started shouting that this red hair reminded him very much of Circinia's hair. At that moment, the witch asked the man how he knew her name, since they had never met before. But he just kept saying that most likely the bastard who caught him was also trying to get the witch this time. After which he explained to the witch who he had so rudely called he was talking about a half-breed who had ascended to the throne quite recently. It turned out that this man was the former butler of the family. He was the hands, ears, and feet of the duchy. At that moment, Circinia remembered that a few days earlier, Verna had mentioned some things about this man. He was the only butler who worked for the Shorbach family for so long. At this point, he began to talk about how, when he was still in service, his master had planned out his entire future life. But then this half-breed appeared. It turned out that the illegitimate Ben had somehow harmed his father after his arrival. Ben was just a fake living a new, unworthy life while hiding behind the shadow of the true owner. At this point, Circinia began to threaten Burdick so that he would not even dare to insult Ben in any way. After all, someone like this butler would never understand what this guy actually went through. At that moment, the man shouted to Circinia that it was Ben who would destroy everything, that everything would collapse because of him. Circinia began to simply run away from him as quickly as possible, so as not to hear these words. After the girl climbed the stairs, she was able to destroy the wall blocking the exit to freedom with one blow. The maid who pushed the witch into that basement was very surprised, after which she immediately began to stop the witch. But instead of an adequate response in her direction, the maid received an angry look and oppression from the girl. When the witch had run away far enough from her, the girl was almost crying because she wanted to hear the truth about the guy. She started running all over the palace and shouting Ben's name so that he would come to her as soon as possible. At this moment, the witch came across Arzan, who was very surprised by the witch's behavior. Circinia immediately ran up to him and began asking about where Ben was now. When the Duke's assistant learned that the girl had just left the secret annex, he was greatly surprised. The witch began to talk about how she had literally just seen everything that was hidden like that, including the prison. After which she asked Arzan whether Ben himself had really been kept in this extension before. Suddenly, the assistant asked the girl to go with him to a less crowded place to discuss everything properly. A few minutes later, the guy and the girl were already at the table where they were pouring themselves some delicious tea. After which Arzan began to talk about how Ben really was not the legitimate heir to the throne. In fact, the former Archduke had a true heir, born from the former Duchess. But this child was very sick, because of which he could not leave his room and go out into the world. But the previous Archduke was very selfish. His only dream was the throne, for which he needed someone who had very good strength. It was because of this that he was ready to do whatever this force needed, even cruel acts. 3 years ago, the Duke's envoys had to kidnap Ben in a not very good way, which, of course, made him unhappy. According to the past Duke, when the group brought the guy, he was very, very pathetic, but there was no choice. The first order was simply to lock him in the very same annex that Circinia had visited. When the order was carried out, the boy screamed loudly to be released and brought back. The guy simply begged to be released because just recently he had promised Circinia to return. After the first 3 days, an exhausted Ben realized that he would not be able to achieve anything at all this way. On this day, Arzan and Ben managed to get to know each other better. When he saw that the kidnapped guy had not eaten anything, he asked about it. It was also on this day that the boy learned that Archduke Shorbach was his father, which Ben could not believe. But despite this, the guy began to ask Arzan to let him out, because he didn't need this whole life. The boy's head was completely filled with thoughts that Circinia had been waiting for him all this time. At this point, Arzan told Ben that if he wanted to meet her so much, he would have to listen. It was then that Ben learned that he had a legitimate brother who, unfortunately, was very ill. When he died, Ben would have to live under his name and history without telling anyone about it. Ben started screaming and asking if he could really meet Circinia after this. But first and foremost, Ben needed to watch his diet and health so as not to die. It was because of this that the guy began to eat as well as possible, but in his head, there were only questions about how the girl was doing. Ben also tried to hope that the witch would live a calm and carefree life while he was gone. He gradually began to exercise to make his body stronger, but he continued to hope that the girl remembered him. His plan was that when he returned, the girl would illuminate him with her wonderful and joyful smile. But he also didn't want to tell the witch what had been going on all this time. Instead, he was ready to lie. After all, he understood perfectly well that if he told it like it was, then most likely the girl would be very worried. He mentally asked Circinia to wait for him until he returned. After a month in prison, Ben began asking Arzan when he would be able to leave, to which he calmly replied that a little more time was needed, thereby upsetting Ben. But in the assistant's head was the fact that he had taken the boy a month ago, but still could not help him get out of the darkness. Receiving the same answer every time, he could one day go crazy and start doing terrible things. Every day, Ben became more and more aggressive. He began to talk more and more about how he had to leave. The boy was gaining more and more strength and voice, which would make it very difficult to stop him later.